Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin here with a huge week of World War III analysis. I've been traveling, so we haven't exactly been on our regular schedule, but so much is going on. It's good to be here bringing it with you once again. There's a huge war that has broken out between Cambodia and Thailand. There are, of course, ceasefire mediation efforts that have been attempted, but conflicts are still raging across the front line, across almost the entire border region at this point. There are major incursions by Thailand into Cambodia. The Cambodians are attempting to do the same thing, launching major MLRS strikes. The Thailand Air Force is using their F-16s. Their Navy has engaged the situation as well. So major escalations. Martial law has been declared in major parts of the country. However, both sides are hesitant to declare a full mobilization into war. So we're going to be watching all of that closely. Of course, the situation in Gaza is what the world is talking about right now, with the genocide escalating, aid convoys, crowds of starving Palestinians approaching. Aid convoys have been shot and bombed by Zionist Jewish genocide forces. So the situation there is escalating. Very unfortunately, negotiations have broken down in Doha between Hamas, Israel, and the United States. It appears that the U.S. is content with allowing Israel to completely genocide the Palestinians in Gaza and annex the entire West Bank, which is currently ongoing. The Knesset even voted with like a 70% majority to annex the West Bank, non-binding, but still a dramatic escalation in that regard. So we're going to be discussing the greater Israel situation, Syria as well. Israel has advanced into Syria, obviously, to help the Druze. They've somewhat withdrawn, but As-Suwaida, that city, that province in southern Syria, entirely occupied by Druze, they've declared autonomy. They are still fighting the Syrian forces, the Bedouin Islamic tribes, despite a ceasefire that was supposedly declared a week ago. So again, these ceasefires, much like in Lebanon, still aren't really binding. Israel and their proxies are doing whatever they want in the region. Obviously, the shadow war between Israel and Iran is continuing. All of these supposed gas leaks across Iran targeting vital infrastructure. Nuclear scientists, military officials are clearly Israel's doing, and the Iranians are trying to cover it up to prevent public outcry within their streets and within the country to continue the strikes on Israel, which again, Israel is openly discussing future strikes on Iran, air blockades, maintaining their air superiority, as well as discussing a potential new offensive against the Houthis, who are continuing to strike Israel. Iran is obviously negotiating with the E3, the UK, Germany, and France, sort of on behalf of the United States about the nuclear situation, which we're going to be breaking all of that down. In the northeast of Syria, the SDF is failing to integrate their Kurdish forces with the Damascus forces, so we're going to be giving a full breakdown on that, as well as the Zangezur corridor, conflicting reports coming from the United States, from Russia, from Armenia, about Armenia supposedly agreeing with Turkey and Azerbaijan to sign over the Zangezur corridor to a U.S. firm. We're then, of course, going to discuss the war in Russia and Ukraine as Russia advances all across the front lines towards Zaporozhye, towards Pokrovsk, into Dnipropetrovsk. Major advancements there. Istanbul negotiations seem to be breaking down, so we're going to be discussing all of that, as well as some major updates with Belarus and some other Russian news. Obviously, other news with the Thailand-Cambodia situation is escalations in the South China Sea. China is escalating against Taiwan, deploying military vessels near North Korea and Japan. North Korea is also escalating a lot of its rhetoric. We're going to discuss some of the troops that are currently in Russia right now. Major news with Serbia, major church news, as well as the UOC has continued to be persecuted by the Ukrainian government. So we're going to be bringing all of this to you and more, all with analysis about the prophecies and how things are going to unfold from an Orthodox Christian perspective. It's great to be back with you this week. And if you haven't already checked out our Ether Hour episode with David Patrick Harry about the Khazars, the Khazarian Empire, it's just been released on the World War Now Substack. It's going to be linked down below. So check that out. Get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co to hear the full conversation with us and him on that very controversial topic. You know, the origin of the Ashkenazi Jews. Are they related to the Khazars? These questions are explored. And of course, you support the show and get access not just to that episode, but hundreds of hours of other exclusive Ether Hour content. So thank you all so much for tuning in. This is going to be a massive episode. I'm already 4 minutes in, still just doing the intro. So Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. It's been an interesting week. As you said, there's the good news, the bad news, and the strange news, because certainly there's been a lot of diplomatic discussions in the Middle East about these various regional conflicts, right? First and foremost, the greatest humanitarian crisis I think we've seen in the last decade at least, the one taking place in Gaza, the genocide of the Palestinian Gazan people. Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Special Envoy, Trump's right-hand man in international diplomacy, the expert on all nations, especially this very fine-tuned man of Jewish origins, has stated that Hamas has openly shown a lack of desire to reach a ceasefire in Gaza, and the U.S. is holding any further peace talks in Doha. The delegations have left Doha in Qatar, and it seems like Hamas has really taken the peace talks off the table. So this is really, really concerning because on one hand, as per the recent Netanyahu interview, which was quite a show, Netanyahu essentially giving a whole speech on the Nelk Boys podcast on YouTube, which I think is a bit of a, I mean, what's next? The Logan Paul podcast appearance of Netanyahu is quite hilarious, I think. But Netanyahu openly stated that until Hamas releases all the hostages, there will not be any ceasefire discussions, at least from the Israeli side. And as you've said, Conrad, the Israelis have already shown unilateral political support, that is in the Knesset, that is the Israeli Congress, the Israeli Parliament, and the Israeli cabinet. Wholesale, three-quarters of both of those groups of powerful Israeli politicians support the annexation of the West Bank. So that is this next step after they've completed their cleansing of political and militants, these terrorist groups occupying Palestine, Gaza, as per Donald J. Trump, who openly has stated that Gaza as well. Gaza will be cleansed from Hamas. The Hamas groups will be hunted down and killed. So Donald J. Trump, again, giving us this powerful hawkish rhetoric that, look, peace talks don't work with terrorists, but they do work with al-Jawlani al-Shara, right? Former al-Qaeda, former HTS leader in Syria. So you see this hypocritical approach. People in the US administration assume that the general public, they probably don't listen to World War Now, for example, the analysis here. They don't watch any deep dive looks. They basically just consume media from CNN or Fox News, and they claim that Hamas and Hezbollah are the only so-called terrorist groups occupying these various Middle Eastern countries and acting as proxies of international states, the Gulf states or Iran or what have you. However, HTS, Al-Qaeda, all these other terrorist groups which are now allied with America, at least officially, most likely on paper, they're, of course, beyond dispute. They're, of course, friendly. Now Donald J. Trump can shake hands with al-Shara. It's completely normal and fine. So the two-faced, hypocritical approach to the war against terror in the Middle East, it's been a thing since, the Soviet intervention into Afghanistan, and it continues to be the status quo, unfortunately. And, the West is, if only we could claim, Conrad, that the West was fighting against terrorism wholesale and the war on terror was at least on some level virtuous. But from what we've seen, unfortunately, these Western countries, including Israel itself, which is a perpetrator of terrorism. Like if Hamas is a terrorist organization, Israel is officially a terrorist state after the 12-day war in Iran. The undisputed killing of innocent people, especially the families of all these nuclear scientists who are also themselves civilian university professors. They're just essentially experts in their fields. They're just nerdy guys who managed to be successful in physics and so forth and so on, and managed to become nuclear experts. Assassinating them and their families is an act of unprovoked terrorism as well. So we can clearly see that the US is happy to support terrorism as long as it pushes the ZOG-controlled military-industrial complex agenda in the Middle Eastern region. So as we see all these peace talks sort of break down, Conrad, I think what the interesting thing is the other two sites of meetings. So Amman, Jordan, we had the leader of the SDF, so the Kurdish resistance essentially in the northeast of Syria, meet with Barak, the US envoy in Syria. And of course, they spoke fluent Arabic to one another, as they are, as the common diplomatic language in that region. So they met in Amman, Jordan. The SDF leader didn't travel, however, to Paris later this week. So that's an interesting push there, almost as if I think he's wary traveling to a Western country. We do remember what happened to the Serbian resistance fighters, right? After the Yugoslav civil wars, those who were prosecuted at The Hague, essentially the Balkan-level Nuremberg trials. So I think there's still some caution, I think, from some of these Syrian resistance leaders, even someone like SDF, supported by Israel, supported by America, to travel to these international countries, which would be rather keen perhaps to try him for certain crimes that took place in Syria in the past. This is general wariness, which I can't say I disagree with. But the other interesting thing is there are rumors, Conrad, of course, coming out of Iran that the IAEA has been or will be invited in soon, and the nuclear discussions will actually resume. So whether or not this is Iran backing down from their previous hawkish stance, or maybe Iran, in fact, has been truly pressured by Russia and China in order to actually come to the table, even after the, well, I'll say, embarrassing and rather powerful attack by both the US and Israel, which has killed thousands of Iranians at this point, whether their international allies are telling them, pressuring them to come to the table, to sit down with these Western superpowers to discuss nuclear enrichment and steps forward. I think this will be rather telling to claim that, well, who actually came out on top of the 12-day war? Was it Israel? Was it Iran? If Iran is now submitting to the willpower of these international major actors like Israel, France, the UK, Germany, then perhaps we can openly state that Israel did win the 12-day war. And in fact, they did force Iran into submission. But nevertheless, the regime of the Ayatollah stands strong. And of course, the Supreme Leader still has unilateral support within Iran, regardless of what the Pahlavi crown prince is doing overseas, which is he's gathering up all of the oppositionary leaders. They're all meeting up in various countries, protesting, and the Iranian opposition. And these are millions of asylum seekers, essentially Iranian refugees, those who do not agree with the Shia extremist regime in Iran. They're all essentially united on the fact that Iran needs a regime change. And of course, we all understand that these oppositionary leaders overseas, they're similar to Navalny, Tikhanovskaya from Belarus. They are very much Western controlled and very pro-Zionist. So we can't really say we agree with them.
Yeah, the situation with the SDF is interesting because at this point, al-Jawlani, al-Shara, the Damascus regime, which are openly receiving armored trucks, high-level infantry materials, all sorts of on-the-ground army equipment from the Turks, they are incapable of fully reclaiming As-Suwaida in a strategically viable way from these Druze militia, the Southern not Transition Council, it's like the Southern Military Council. I'm forgetting the name of the Druze sort of separatist militia council that has formed to defend them from the HTS regime. But they've been able to declare autonomy. Al-Jawlani has not been able to secure them. He was forced to cave to pressure to restrain the Islamic forces that were trying to retake the city, or else he would have lost a lot of his international recognition. He's very much trying to secure billions and billions of dollars of U.S. and Saudi and Qatari investment to rebuild the country, to repay all of their debts, to secure the realm, as it were. And at this point, besides al-Jawlani, al-Shara himself, Mazloum Abdi, the head of the SDF, is pretty much the second most powerful man in Syria. He supposedly controls over 100,000 troops. These are largely Kurdish forces. And he, of course, is sort of the only kind of secular, progressive, as it could be viewed from the West, at least relatively speaking, leader currently operating there. So he has a lot of leverage. He has a lot of clout. The U.S. seems willing to largely support him. They're not going to allow Turkey, who is his main enemy, to sort of roll in and steamroll him. So it's an interesting development for sure. And Israel is obviously going to be trying to keep the Druze and the Kurds as, autonomous and independent as possible to prevent whoever comes to power in Damascus from ever actually being able to challenge, Israel's hegemony in the region. There's even reports that recently Israel has been threatening Lebanon and claiming that Syria is going to take all of northern Lebanon and that they're going to allow them to do that under, to recognize al-Jawlani, al-Shara. They're going to give them all sorts of Lebanon, which is a punishment to the Lebanese for not disarming Hezbollah, which currently the U.S. envoy to Turkey, Tom Barak, who is also in charge of Lebanon affairs in a lot of ways, is giving them a 90-day deadline to disarm Hezbollah. He's claiming that 90-day deadline, even if they do disarm it, though, will not actually require Israel to withdraw from southern Lebanon, which despite the November ceasefire, they have yet to do. So you're seeing a pattern here in the region where the U.S. is stepping in perpetually to just make sure that Israel is allowed to maintain its chaotic status quo that allows it to slowly but surely entrench itself in southern Syria. I mean, the Golan Heights used to be the sort of contested region. That's long gone in the past. Who's talking about the Golan Heights being retaken at this point? They're in Quneitra. They're in As-Suwaida at this point. So all of their gains that were previously contested in the 2010s in these places are now completely secure because they've moved on to new things and are arguing against people for things that never should have been taken, like Mount Hermon. And I mean, they're setting up a concentration camp in southern Gaza. And this takes us back to the collapsing negotiations in Qatar. The U.S., Hamas, everybody's withdrawn their negotiating factions. And of course, Israel and the U.S. are blaming Hamas. But it seems that all Hamas really wanted was in response to the announcement of the huge concentration, quote unquote, refugee camp built in southern Gaza that happened, during the last truce. Hamas just wanted a stronger guarantee that any future 60-day ceasefire would actually lead to a permanent one. And Hamas has always said that a permanent ceasefire, if it was actually agreed to, would lead to the immediate release of all hostages currently within Gaza. In lieu of that, of course, however, this is according to Axios, Hamas had asked for more Palestinian prisoners to be released in exchange for Israeli captives, including 2,000 Palestinians who had been abducted in Gaza since October 7th, 2023, instead of the 1,200 that the U.S. and Israel proposed. The two sides have also been at odds over the amount of territory Israel will occupy, as Israel is refusing to withdraw its forces back to the positions it held during the short-lived ceasefire deal that was signed in January 2025. And again, this comes amidst major losses that the Israelis have taken from Al-Qassam brigades, Hamas forces, truck full of 11, I think, Israelis. I think there were women soldiers was struck, and I think a lot of them died. There have been other major collapses. Hamas has bombed ruined houses and had the rubble collapse on Israeli soldiers, and they all died. So this is leading to major pressure from Israeli society as well. And unfortunately, though, in the midst of these withdrawals of the talks and Witkoff and Trump both openly blaming Hamas, it leads to the U.S. being more supportive of stuff like this, with the headline being Israeli minister, Gaza will be wiped out and will become totally Jewish. And this is Israeli Heritage Minister Amichai Eliyahu said on Thursday that Israel was working to wipe out the Gaza Strip and called for the Palestinian territory to be settled by Jews, saying it will become totally Jewish. The government is racing ahead for Israel to be wiped out, Eliyahu said in a radio interview, according to the Times of Israel. Thank God we are wiping out this evil. We are pushing this population that has been educated on Mein Kampf. The minister, who is also a member of Itamar Ben-Gvir's Jewish Power Party, said that Gaza will be cleared for Jewish settlements, but said that Jewish towns wouldn't be fenced in inside cantons. All of Gaza will be Jewish, he said. According to the Times, Eliyahu said Arabs who are loyal to the state of Israel could be tolerated, but it's unclear what that means. We aren't racists, he said. The Israeli minister also denied that there was hunger inside Gaza, even though people have begun starving to death every day. There's no hunger in Gaza, he said, but we don't need to be concerned with hunger in the Strip. Let the world worry about it. Man, I can't even. These people are so disgusting, man. Mm-hmm. Eliyahu has a history of making genocidal statements about the Palestinians in Gaza. In 2023, he suggested that dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza was an option, and that there was no such thing as uninvolved civilians in Gaza. He said at the time that Gaza didn't have a right to exist, and that anyone waving Hamas or Palestinian flag shouldn't continue living on the face of the earth. So this guy is clearly a wonderful individual, and I think it's funny that he says we aren't racists. And in a way, I almost agree with him, because racism and racist as an epithet is a term made up by Jews that really only applies to white people. So this guy isn't necessarily a racist per se. He's just an evil spawn of Satan and will burn in hell. So that's sort of, I think we don't need to be throwing around racist as if that's the worst thing ever, when these are the people that came up with it. We can just say that they're evil and push for our government to not be occupied by them, which is what really makes this so disgusting. If this guy was just some wayward, guy with his weird little hat and his stupid little desert religion talking about this nonsense to some little group of retards, then it'd be okay. But no, he's a high-ranking official, the heritage minister of a government that is propped up with billions and billions of taxpayer dollars from the United States, from other Western countries. So that's what makes this so disgusting. But the reality of the situation is that there are people starving, even though he tried. It's sort of a weird thing. He basically says we should starve these people. I support it, but it's also not happening. So, it's a pretty disgusting way of going about things. But obviously in Gaza, they are starving because that ship, I think it left on July 13th or whatever. I'm forgetting the name of the ship. It was sort of part of the Greta Thunberg, aid convoy trying to break the sea blockade that the Israelis have obviously imposed on Gaza. Because at one point early on in the war, after October 7th, Hamas was even able to conduct a few more naval attacks on Israel. They sort of had a coastal navy thing going on, which is obviously, not only has that been destroyed, but I'm not sure Gazans are even able to go to the beach at this point. I mean, I remember at one point there were aid things that were dropped towards Gazans on the beach that had bombs in them and this sort of thing. So it's really just a hellish situation that we need to keep in our prayers. But that ship that was going to, this new ship that left on the 13th from Italy, going slowly across the Mediterranean to breach this blockade, they reached Gaza and were then promptly fired upon and completely boarded by Israeli stormtroopers. So this ship that contained nothing but aid, that was openly traveling with the full eye of the public on it. There might have even been people posting on social media from the ship, like we know Greta Thunberg and these others were. They were immediately stopped and raided by the Israelis, which again, do they not, it's just clear they don't care about optics. They don't care about what people think about them. They are just going with full spectrum dominance and control to make sure that they are able to adequately genocide the population of Gaza. And I think that they're worried about the fact that the pressure from the international community will mount enough to where they won't be able to actually kill all 2 million Gazans, but they want to basically destroy and beat down the will of these people so thoroughly, make them all witness so many atrocities and feel like any form of resistance in the future is so futile that the ones that do survive and end up getting shipped to Libya, Somaliland, or France, as Garrett Wilders now wants to ship them, these people will not, feel any fire within their souls to fight against the Jewish menace that killed their family members, that drove them from their homes, and has been a scourge not just against them, but on the whole world for so long now. They want to make sure that never happens again, because right now, as long as millions of Palestinians live, there are millions of people that are willing to take up arms against Israel, and rightfully so. And the longer that they exist with that spirit, they will inspire more people in the West and elsewhere around the world that will realize what was done to them and what Israel plans to do to the rest of the world, the rest of the Goyim. And that's something that they just can't tolerate. And this brings us to the real big news regarding Palestine here. And before I read it, I'll briefly talk about what's going on in the West Bank. This is from Mondevice. It says Israel is changing the legal system governing the West Bank to accelerate annexation. Israel is accelerating its efforts to cement its permanent control over the West Bank through a number of sweeping legal and institutional changes, according to a new report from Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. And I believe 71 members of the Knesset, again, recently voted to annex the West Bank. Apparently, this 87-page report describes the ways in which the Netanyahu government is rapidly building on a long-standing legal matrix that further threatens Palestinians' rights to self-determination. These developments are not something new to us. What is happening in the West Bank is dangerously fast-forwarding annexation policies and a blatant violation of international law. Israel is intensifying measures to change the status of the West Bank, the status of many Palestinians living in Area C, who are subject to intensified displacement induced by settler violence and Israeli policies. For those who don't know what this means, West Bank Area C is directly overseen by Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, who is a genocidal maniac who gives speeches on a podium with Greater Israel map in front of it. And for context, Area C is 60% of the West Bank. So that's full military control already, and they're now expanding into the other 40% with a lot of this legal mumbo jumbo, which is the same kind of stuff they use to steal Christian, Armenian and other territory in the old city of Jerusalem, for example. But as all of this is going on, as it seems that Witkoff and Trump, of course, with their $100 million from Miriam Adelson, where they already promised to do this years ago, are fully in support of Israel annexing the West Bank. They're openly calling it Judea and Samaria, as the Jews like to call it. But as all this is going on, and he's embroiled in legal battles with Candace Owens, accusing his wife of being a man. This is from Middle East Eye. France to recognize Palestinian state at UN General Assembly in September. President Emmanuel Macron also said ending the war in Gaza was urgently needed. French President Emmanuel Macron has announced that France will recognize a Palestinian state at the UN General Assembly in September. I've decided that France will recognize the state of Palestine. He said, I will make this solemn announcement at the United Nations General Assembly in September. Macron's statement was posted on X along with a copy of a letter addressed to Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, dated 24th of July. The urgent need today is to end the war in Gaza and to provide relief to the civilian population. Peace is possible. He added that the demilitarization of Hamas was key to securing and rebuilding Gaza. We must immediately implement a ceasefire, release all hostages, and provide massive humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. Israel's Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Minister Yariv Levin on Thursday condemned France's move to recognize a Palestinian state, calling it a black mark on French history and a direct aid to terrorism. Levin said France's shameful decision meant it was now time to apply Israeli sovereignty to the occupied West Bank, which Israel has illegally occupied since 1967. Macron said a viable Palestinian state must recognize Israel and contribute to the overall security of the region. There is no alternative, he said. So again, the moment that these European leaders and anyone with actual power, we've already had Spain, we've already had a few other countries recognize Palestine, but France, an E3 nation, a major NATO power, major military power in the region, considering their relationships with Lebanon, Egypt, these other places, this is a big deal. The Israelis don't like it, and they're now immediately using it as a pretext to, as I just said earlier, escalate their annexation of the West Bank. And even more scary to the Israelis than France is the even more powerful UK. And this comes amidst, Keir Starmer has been talking about potentially recognizing Palestine. Unfortunately, the UK obviously a much stronger Israeli occupation than even France. But the SNP, which is the liberal minority party that I believe they do caucus with the Labour Party in some capacity, they're threatening to force a vote on recognizing a Palestinian state. And this is from FMT, a minor opposition party in the British Parliament, on Sunday threatened to bring forward legislation on recognizing Palestinian statehood and force a vote if Prime Minister Keir Starmer continues to oppose the move. The Scottish National Party, which pushes for the independence of Scotland, said it would table a Palestinian recognition bill when Parliament returns after its summer recess if Starmer did not change his position. The Prime Minister has committed to recognizing Palestinian statehood, but said it must be part of a peace process in the Middle East. The SNP threat comes after more than 220 British MPs, including dozens from Starmer's ruling Labour Party, demanded Friday that the UK government follow France and recognize a Palestinian state. The call in a letter signed by lawmakers from 9 UK political parties came less than 24 hours after French President Emmanuel Macron said that his country would formally do so at the UN meeting in September. And then the Israelis came out and said that it would be detrimental to the United Kingdom if they did come out and recognize a Palestinian state. I don't know if this is some kind of threat. But again, like I said earlier, Geert Wilders, known Zionist, anti-Muslim politician, a leader in the Netherlands who hasn't actually done anything to stand against Muslim migration or the Great Replacement in the Netherlands. He's just stood fervently with Israel and their genocide. He then claimed that, Palestine should be created in France and we should send all the Palestinians there. So he gets elected running against the Great Replacement and the replacement of white people by Muslims in the West. And then because Israel supports it, he now actually supports bringing millions of Muslims to the West. So this is why the dividing line and the friend-enemy distinction here within politics needs to be the Jewish question and Christian identity, which of course does obviously have a racial ethnic component to it, as opposed to, based Western civilization, we're going to stand with Jews against the Muslims. Yeah, that's a psyop. So I think a lot of people are getting wise to that at this point, and it doesn't need to be so thoroughly explained. But I think the fact that France is recognizing this Palestinian state, and it is a Fatah state, it is thoroughly under the control of Mahmoud Abbas, who is an Israeli collaborator, and it is something that would still largely benefit Israel. The Israelis still can't have it. Like the statement says, Hamas must be disarmed. The state must recognize Israel, but it isn't a blank slate to genocide the Palestinians, which is what the Israelis want. So they come out as if Macron is anti-Semitic. They're calling France an anti-Semitic state. I'm sure they're kvetching and bringing up, the Bourbon dynasties and when the French burned the Talmud and all the horrible things that have happened in French history against the Jewish people, supposedly. And, again, despite the fact that it was such a pro-Israel statement, it was like the least amount of crumbs that the West could give to the Palestinians to say that they support them, and the Israelis could not even have it, and the kvetching became just awful. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, Dimitri, before we discuss the rest of the region and then move on.
Absolutely. The West Bank, I think, Conrad, people need to appreciate how serious this is and what the precedent has been created. The precedent created in Eastern Europe, how will that potentially impact the Orthodox Christians or even Roman Catholics, Protestant, all the Christians living in the West Bank who are, there's much denser Christian population there, including native Palestinians, not just monastics from all kinds of European and essentially around the world living there. Pilgrim facilities set up there since the times of Imperial Russia, which we've covered in our previous Aether Hour episodes on Palestine and the Holy Land. Keep in mind, when they start taking over these cities, towns, and essentially when the occupation of the West Bank will begin in earnest by the Israeli terror state, the Zionists, there will be all kinds of fake news thrown into the mix, similar to what's happening in Ukraine. They're going to claim, the old calendarist Orthodox Christians, that is the actual Jerusalem Patriarchate of Theophilus III, they're pro-Russian. So you'll see all kinds of stories, for example, and I'm speaking hypothetically here, you'll have claims that the old calendar itself is anti-Semitic. Well, clearly, because the new calendar was created by Meletios Metaxakis and friends, Freemasons, and Freemasons equals, Talmudic Judaism, essentially. So there'll be claims that the old calendar, that's a hyper-conservative, reactionary, has ties to impure Russia. Tsar Nicholas II was a big-time anti-Semite, apparently. Theophilus III is pro-Russian, so is John X of Antioch. There'll be all kinds of fake news thrown into the mix. There'll be, of course, claims that the Russian monasteries, churches belonging to both the MP and Rokor are in some capacity pro-Russian, again, Russian agents, just like claims against the UOC in Ukraine. I think all these fake news stories and disinformation will be utilized at the same time in order to throw a wrench into the proclamations, I think, of the Christian community around the world that the church is being persecuted in Israel. And I think clearly, if not the church, then the actual Christians are being persecuted actively in Israel. And we can clearly see this because there's Christians being killed. And we can say that not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank. And surely soon this will, of course, escalate, unfortunately, judging by the statements of official Israeli cabinet members and Knesset members from various parties, not just the Likud. So this is incredibly concerning. We need to be prepared for that. And of course, when it happens, and God forbid that it does happen, but if it does, we'll cover it on this show in all its unfortunate and horrific details, I think. So that's really important. And speaking of horrific details, I'm sure most of you have seen or at least heard of the various beheadings taking place, as you said, Conrad, in the southwestern corner of Syria in the Druze provinces. So even though we don't necessarily agree with the Druze theologically, and we have stated many times that the Druze religion in and of itself is like a proto-Manichaean Satanism type of institution, we can't deny that the Salafist Wahhabist terrorists there, including there's apparently claims that the ISIS were actually heavily involved, like literal ISIS, like Daesh, like they call themselves the Lions of Islam or whatnot. They were actively perpetrating crimes against the Druze there, at least being used as a certain hammer of the al-Jilani, al-Shura regime against the Druze. So it's very interesting because we saw the beheadings of the sheikh, of the Druze sheikh. And again, beheadings is very, not just a Talmudic method, but also Islamic terrorism. It's a common theme. We saw this by the Taliban committed that they tried to behead many Americans during Operation Anaconda in Afghanistan. We saw beheadings, of course, by ISIS of Christians and all kinds of Syrians in the Syrian civil war as well. So beheadings is, typically an Islamic sort of extremist strategy that they use in order to bring fear and demoralization into the communities in which they want to take over, and of course bring Sharia law into by force, which is, by the way, not really what Hamas is about, but we do have to keep an eye out on any sort of connections between HTS and Hamas, which recently there haven't really been any highlighted links there, but this is the ace up the Zionist sleeve, Conrad, is to bring that if the al-Shura, al-Jilani regime falls into disfavor with the West and Israel, right? And for example, if there's a certain breakdown between the Erdogan, and mind you, Erdogan is part of Turkey, which is NATO, which has nuclear missiles on its territory. So it's hard to imagine a US-Turkey confrontation. But if there ever is one, they'll bring up the fact that Hamas and HTS have collaborated, or at least have supported one another in the past. And they'll use this as a PR talking point in order to discredit both movements, of course, and most likely to divide Syria even further. And I would also bring up the fact that this idea that every ethnicity, every little tribe on the map needs its own nation state, I'll just say it's far from Christian. It's far from a Christian political belief. It's far from, I think, any sort of Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox theory of how polity should exist, because, the Orthodox Christian political subject is the emperor, hence the empire, the theme that many different ethnicities and tribes can coexist under one rulership is very common. So the idea of an ethno-state has existed in certain cultures, for example, in Georgia, but even Georgia it does have other ethnic minorities, but the Woodrow Wilson sort of Theodore Roosevelt, Ulyanov Blanc Lenin model of every nation needs its own, every nation needs its nation state, every ethnicity needs to be divided, just like Russia, the Russian Federation has many of these national republics. What's happening in Syria right now, as you said, Conrad, there's division, the cracks that are being created amongst different ethnicities. It's to destabilize Syria and essentially turn it into a political wasteland for decades to come, essentially allowing Israel as a politically united nation state to then eventually take over, potentially militarily expand. So this cracked land that's being created right now in Syria, divided. And again, these Woodrow Wilson, right, big time, shall we say, philo-Semite, Roosevelt himself, of course, supporter of the Nuremberg trials, etc. These are all people who have pushed these ideas that every nation state should have internal divisions amongst ethnicities, and there should be some sort of ethnic recognitions. And the breakdown of empire is a big theme that libtards and Marxists have used over the entire 20th century, which also led to the fall of Rhodesia and the creation of Zimbabwe as well. So you can kind of trace this idea, and it's still being used, and it's being used in Syria actively today. The Kurds need their own independent nation state. So do the Syrians, so do, of course, the Druze, the various other ethnic minorities. It needs to break down into little pieces and then, of course, swallowed up by its more powerful neighbor in the southwest, that is Israel. So very cautionary tale there. But most importantly, I think if you look north of the border, Conrad, the entire Syrian situation, the recent meeting of the Gulf state oligarchs, the analysis that has been brought forward by our 8th-hour episodes, they have revealed the fact that Syria today is very much, it's a battlefield between mostly non-BRIC states. You have America, of course, funding the SDF. You have Turkey essentially running the Idlib province, using it as a base camp. You have Israel, of course, influencing the Druze. It is a battlefield wherein Russia almost has no presence whatsoever, except for, of course, Latakia and Tartus, which, again, are very limited. Russia hasn't been seen to carry out any sort of military exercises or even any sorties. They haven't even flown their planes out of the Latakia airfield anytime in recent months, actually, since the fall of the Assad regime. And this does point towards a potential isolation of Syria from any of those BRICS countries. And of course, the radical form of Islam, which has taken over in Syria and which is responsible for all those various beheadings. And just keep in mind, HTS, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, there may be organizational differences and hierarchical differences among them, but theologically, they're all the same. So theologically, they all agree. They probably follow the same Islamic teachings. They follow the same hadiths. They all agree. And speaking of France, I think France is really, I wish I could say France was the sort of the dark horse in the race of the geopolitical tensions that are building up to World War III, and frankly, in this Third World War, which we are in now. But France, unfortunately, due to its heavily Masonic leadership elite, are shutting down any potential of France being able to choose between, the forces of the Antichrist and, again, the forces that potentially will oppose the reign of the Antichrist in Israel and the creation of maybe a multipolar world, which will continue to exist for several decades onwards, and maybe will even extend world history forward a little bit before the ascension of that dark Moshiach in Jerusalem. So France recently has passed a very interesting decision in one of its top courts, right? I believe it's the French Supreme Court. It essentially annulled the arrest warrant against Bashar al-Assad, the former president of Syria, and the court essentially was investigating Assad's 2013 chemical attacks against, which Assad carried out potentially these chemical attacks against terrorists on his territory, but they were against, according to the court, citizens and civilians of Syria, right? These are the famous chemical attacks which everyone speaks about. It's almost like creates an almost, shall we say, Auschwitzian narrative in Syria. But nevertheless, the French court has deemed Assad to be entirely innocent and immune to any of these accusations because he was the reigning president. So they've stated that the court decided there were no exceptions to presidential immunity, even for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. So a sitting president can actually carry out, or a sitting executive member in the cabinet, I have to say, can carry out war crimes and still be seen as unless his own country, for example, imprisons him or takes him out of office, an international court cannot somehow impinge upon that. But keep in mind, it's not just against Assad that these accusations are levied against, right, Conrad? The ICC has also accused and put out a warrant for Netanyahu. So France, by addressing this Dr. Assad precedent, has also granted Netanyahu complete immunity from prosecution, at least in France, potentially in the whole European Union. And because, the European Union does share certain legal precedents in Brussels and Berlin and Paris, there is some sort of overlap there, jurisdictionally speaking. So it'll be very interesting. Netanyahu may be completely free of charges to travel all around Europe shortly, despite the fact that the EU, it's supported both the Hague and Nuremberg trials. France is supposed to be this big arbiter of international rules order, right? And especially this new legal system that's supposed to protect against war crimes. I mean, this was the claim historically, but coincidentally, we do know who supported it.
Yep. International law can't apply to the international Jew. It's meant for the Goyim like us. Like the fact that system turned on them, they're going to reverse that very quickly.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we see happening. So I would say, yes, it's good news for Dr. Assad, but we have to look a little bit beyond the pale, right? It wasn't just for Assad that the court made this ruling. It was for other people, including potentially maybe Putin's telephone call with Macron. Who knows what? Putin maybe wants to retire. We know Putin was on holidays in France. He liked to go on holidays to France in the early 2000s and the late 1990s with his family. So the Russo-French axis connection is very strong. And I would also add that Charles de Gaulle's grandson, actually, and Charles de Gaulle himself, if you're this post-World War II French president, one of the most influential Frenchmen in French history, I would say, in post-revolutionary history, he was actually not pro-Soviet, but he was very pro-Russian. He would always call the Soviet Union Russia. He would never call it the USSR. He said, well, Russia's communist now, but eventually communism will fall. He was a very interesting figure, per se. And in fact, there are Russian historians who claim that Joseph Stalin actually supported de Gaulle's presidency, or him coming to power in France in the first place. And France would never have been even among the victors, and it wouldn't have been present at Nuremberg if not for the USSR. The USSR wanted France to be among the countries counted as the victors, despite the fact that more Frenchmen died fighting for the Third Reich than against it, mind you, in World War II. So people have a very warped history of what the Second World War was. It was France essentially was allied with Germany for a majority of that war. It wasn't the other way around. But Joseph Stalin, this is the Stalinist era connection, creation of Israel, all these little stories mix and turn. But the grandson of Charles de Gaulle, by the way, Pierre de Gaulle, I think he's been granted Russian citizenship, but he openly stated that NATO and Zelensky have essentially declared war against Russia. So he's a very pro-Russian figure, similar, I guess, to Gabriel the Russian. So we do see that potentially in the future of France, there will be some sort of pro-Russian turn. And the historical analogy here, Conrad, is of course if you recall the last Latin king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, also the king of Cyprus for a long time, when he's the present as essentially the villain in the Ridley Scott movie Kingdom of Heaven. He marries, of course, Queen Sibylla of Jerusalem, and his descendants, 700 or 800 years later, travel to the Russian Empire and they become citizens of Nicholas I. Nicholas I even has a plan that if Russia, during the Crimean and post-Crimean War, ever takes over the Holy Land, he will make the descendants of Guy de Lusignan, these Russian French princes, again, the kings of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So Nicholas I, Romanov there's some pretty cool ideas in the future. So the Franco-Russian relationship, unfortunately, it breaks on this Masonic, degenerate connection that the French elites still have to their past faults. And unfortunately, France is still very much occupied. And as you said, Conrad, the Zionist angle as well is still there. And it's very sad because France could be one of these ostensibly independent actors in world affairs, similar to China and India, perhaps, but it's entirely occupied at this point. So it's very sad. Very talented people, the Celtic, Germanic people of France, and are just completely subverted at this point. So we just have to keep analyzing the situation. But it's no surprise that most of these peace talks either take place around Paris or Paris is seen as this international neutral playing ground. Because if you recall, even Khomeini himself, the first supreme leader of Iran, where did he stay for a few months to a year after his exile from Iran and Iraq? He stayed in France. So he flew from France to revolutionary Iran and carried out the revolution of 1979. I'm not saying the Iranian Revolution was a French psyop, but, it's worth looking into.
Yeah, the French situation is fascinating because I think regarding Russia as well, it would be much more positive if there hadn't been that big purge of the French military right at the beginning of the special military operation.
Mm-hmm.
There were all those generals that were openly saying very similar things to, Charles de Gaulle's son and those sorts of statements about NATO and aggression against the Russians and historical ties, and all those people got purged. Unfortunately, Macron has taken us in a very bad direction, and it's even more unfortunate because it cements that scary dialectic that we've talked about before, where in France, you have a progressive pro-Palestine faction that's even willing to go against world Jewry in some capacity, but they're only going to empower, the moderate, pro-Israel Palestinians, and they hate Russia. Whereas the right wing in France, you have Le Pen and Bardella and these people, they are fully embracing Israel, and French Jewry who are having a similar episode as in America where they're turning to the right. They realize that all these Muslims they brought in hate them and they want to, bolster. I mean, literally look at Zemmour. Zemmour himself is an Algerian Jew, and he ran on actually deporting minorities on an ethnic basis before that was even as mainstream as it is in the West right now. So the identitarian turn in a lot of these countries, the UK and France in particular, is unfortunately likely to be philo-Semitic. And that's why Germany is the country that is the most sort of cracking down on its nationalists, because fundamentally the Germans, at least a large percentage of them, know, and because of the legacy of World War II and the debt that Germany had to Israel and all this nonsense, the German right that are, awake and aware of the Great Replacement and the identitarian issues are also very aware that it is the Jews and the Israelis and world Jewry that have foisted it upon them. But unfortunately, they are the most under pressure from the legal, constitutional office in Germany to not ever talk about that because you will instantly go to jail. But before we move on to talking about the Istanbul negotiations in Russia and Ukraine, I do need to mention final things about the SDF. Of course, this is from Kurdistan 24. Sinan Mohammed, the representative of the Syrian Democratic Council in Washington, has firmly rejected mounting Turkish pressure to accelerate the integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces into the Syrian Arab Army, warning that any such move must follow a comprehensive political transition and drafting of a new constitution. In an exclusive statement to Kurdistan 24, Mohammed stressed that the approach Turkey wants to impose, though hasty and coercive, pressure to resolve everything with the Damascus government is neither feasible nor acceptable. Mohammed emphasized that the SDF is a major force and cannot be disbanded or integrated in a day or a night. She reiterated that before any discussion of military integration, all other armed factions in Damascus was also undergo reform and restructuring, and the entire process must be anchored in a democratic roadmap. So it's clear that the U.S. is sort of using SDF integration because it'd be a huge force integrated into, very well trained as well, integrated into the Damascus military. They're sort of using it as a sort of a carrot stick thing to get the entire Syrian military to reform to a more pro-American, secular, progressive sort of approach. And that's what's going on. So at the end of the statement, she concluded by asserting that for now, nothing of that sort has begun, reaffirming that the process of integration has yet to formally start. Mohammed's remarks come at a time of heightened diplomatic engagement between Syrian Kurdish leadership and international stakeholders amid ongoing discussions about a future Syrian settlement and the role of a northeast Syria within it. And of course, Turkey and the SNA stand ready to attack the SDF at any time. I'm sure they would like to. I think they're holding off right now, but they continue to arm the Damascus government, I think hardening making the HTS, formerly HTS government forces in Damascus, much more like the SNA, which is the true Turkish proxy that hates the SDF, that wants to control Kurdish territory in Syria and Iraq at the behest of Turkey. That's the real force that wants to do that. So Turkey fully extended into the region. And I realized before we talk about the Istanbul agreements, we have to talk about what's going on just north of what's going on with the SDF in Syria, and that is these reports about the Zangezur corridor, which we have conflicting reports. This is from the Cradle here, and this is what broke a few days ago. Armenia to cede control of Zangezur corridor to U.S., report says. A confidential memorandum obtained by Periodista Digital reveals a controversial agreement that would place Armenia's Zangezur corridor under U.S. control for 99 years, effectively surrendering key national territory to U.S. private military companies and facilitating unimpeded Azerbaijani access to Nakhchivan and Turkey. The document, titled Memorandum of Understanding on the Creation of the Trump Bridge Transport Corridor, has reportedly been approved by Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the U.S., according to the Spanish newspaper. It outlines the creation of a 42-kilometer economic and military corridor through Armenia's Syunik region along the Iranian border, a key demand of Azerbaijan following the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. Although the agreement affirms Armenia's sovereignty over the Syunik region, the corridor itself will be operated and secured by a licensed U.S. private military company, which is expected to deploy approximately 1,000 personnel. The PMC will be authorized to use force to preserve the integrity of the corridor, effectively placing it outside Armenian control. Financially, the arrangement disproportionately favors Washington, as the U.S. management company will receive 40% of the revenue generated by the corridor, while Armenia will receive only 30%. According to the report, the corridor's militarization by U.S. proxy forces also reflects broader strategic goals by establishing a permanent U.S. foothold on Iran's border. Though initially unarmed with heavy weaponry, the presence of U.S. aligned forces on the Armenian-Iran frontier marks a major geopolitical shift. Because obviously, this is all coming after the Russians have been completely driven out by Pashinyan and the Armenians, driving Russia into the arms of Azerbaijan. But, and Dmitry has some on this in a second, Russo-Azerbaijani relations are still in the tank, and we've discussed at this point Russia using their soft power to influence and potentially oust Pashinyan. But I'm going to finish reading this. The memorandum has sparked outrage among some Armenians and members of the Armenian diaspora, with many calling Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan's agreement to the terms an act of national betrayal. Critics argue that the deal strips Armenia of its sovereignty while serving the strategic interests of the U.S. and Turkey, a longtime enemy and perpetrator of a genocide against Armenians. France, long seen as a key ally of Armenia and co-chair of the OSCE Minsk Group, is expected to lose significant influence as a result of the corridor's implementation. According to Forbes, energy flows underscore the urgency of Baku's effort to establish a territorial connection to Turkey. Gaining access to the Zangezur corridor would allow Azerbaijan to expand its oil empire to Europe via Turkey. Europe continues to look for sources of oil and gas that can replace purchases from Russia amid the ongoing war with Ukraine. The IEA's 2025 World Energy Outlook project projects Europe needs 20 billion cubic meters more non-Russian gas by 2030. Normalized Armenia-Turkey borders could enhance access to Caspian reserves, potentially cutting import costs by 10 to 15% for firms like BP, Forbes adds. However, we've seen all of this. However, according to Eurasia Daily, Armenia did not accept the U.S. proposal on the Zangezur corridor. Armenia did not accept the U.S. offer to lease a 42-kilometer road through Syunik, the Zangezur corridor. This was stated by the head of the People's Assembly Commission on European Integration, Arman Egoyan. We saw the danger of ceding sovereignty, Egoyan told Factor. According to him, the Armenian government agrees to consider the issue of unblocking communications in the region within the framework of compliance with the principles of sovereignty, jurisdiction, and reciprocity and territorial integrity. As EA Daily reported the day before, the information department of the Armenian government denied the information of the Spanish edition Periodista Digital about the coordination by Yerevan, Baku, and Washington of a memorandum on the creation of the Zangezur corridor, the Trump Bridge. According to the newspaper, the memorandum provides for the implementation of a 42-kilometer corridor. I just described everything there. So Armenians are denying this. I'm wondering if this is something that they agreed to and are now backing off on because of internal Russian pressure. This is the kind of thing that I think if it was agreed to, a sort of Russian-backed coup within Armenia likely could work. But again, if this was real, this would be an insane development in the World War Now extended universe, as it were, completely putting a U.S. private military presence on the Iranian border, totally neutralizing Armenia as any kind of pro-Russian actor in the region. And frankly, if it wasn't for the more Georgian turn towards Russia in the past 2 years, it would mean the entire Caucasus region would be completely compromised to U.S.-Turkish interests. The Iranians are getting completely boxed out of the region. And this article talked about France losing out, much like France is actually losing out if there's regime change in Iran, because France has corporate energy interests there that they have signed agreements with, and that connects them to Armenia because Iran and Russia are ostensibly Armenia's two allies in the region. And if the U.S. was able to get them to agree to something like this, it would mean that Pashinyan has fully broken Armenia away from that axis, which, again, you'd think would have been pushing Azerbaijan in that same direction. But Azerbaijan has been escalating against Russia on its own much more dramatically, which I think has forced Russia. Again, it's just so frustrating. If the Russians had just been willing to side with the Armenians and actually defend them against Azerbaijan back in 2020, we wouldn't be in this situation, which takes us back to the statement. I had a tweet recently about how, the Russians, if they had just been listening to the prophecies and listening to the show, they'd be saving themselves a lot of future trouble. But unfortunately, the prophecies themselves state that that's not exactly the path that the Russians are going to follow, and they will be forced into taking the actions that they ultimately do. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Zangezur corridor situation, Dimitri, because we've been talking about this for a long time. And when you think about how it relates to Kurdistan, everything we're talking about in Syria, Iran-Rus relations and all of that, and then everything we talked about with George McMillan, which everyone needs to go back and watch, things all really start to come together. And obviously the prophecies, that discuss Russia descending down into the region and the independence of a bigger Armenia and an independent Kurdistan, the Zangezur corridor seems very relevant to all of that.
Absolutely. I think economically speaking and geopolitically, this does force Russia, so to speak, out of the region. And we did not think it would get to this point. The news that broke out in April 2024 when the Russian peacekeepers left Nagorno-Karabakh, we didn't think, I think, Conrad, that it would get to this really. The fact that Armenia was still in the CSTO and Azerbaijan wasn't, it really does show that overall, this was a greater Turkish victory. Like whatever we saw since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, this entire Nagorno-Karabakh conflict ended up being a joint Azeri-Turkic victory, and maybe even the victory of NATO. Now, if this is really going to be called the Trump corridor, we can clearly say that this quasi-CSTO NATO war that took place in the Southern Caucasus did end in essentially a NATO victory over the CSTO alliance, and essentially may have spelled death of the CSTO as an agreement, generally speaking, now that we see, for example, officers and military experts from Kazakhstan traveling to the British Isles of Albion to train. And what the precedent for that is similar to the Ukrainian experts going to fight in Iraq with NATO and the joint peacekeeping alliance. They're essentially learning from these Western experts. This is preparing, of course, Kazakhstan for a future potential conflict with Russia, which at the moment you'll already see mainstream Western sources kind of predicting ahead of time, because we do have to openly state that most of these conflicts we speak about, all the borders that were created throughout the 20th century, they do not logically align. And we'll reference, of course, Cambodia and Thailand in a moment later on in the episode. But keep in mind the Kazakhstan-Russian Federation border is not just illogical, it's completely drawn up under the influence of some sort of narcotic substances, that's for sure, in the offices of Stalin and the other leaders of the Politburo. So very concerning, because it does spell for future conflicts in the area, which, again, we don't want them, but we just have to report on these things. But Armenia, generally speaking, Conrad, we have to keep in mind the spiritual purges taking place there, the various conflicts are very complicated. The Armenian Apostolic Church, as they call it themselves, Orthodox Armenians, so to speak, but not parts of of course, not connected to the Eastern Orthodox Church, as rejectors of Chalcedon and the other ecumenical councils. The weird thing is about the structure of their church is that they have essentially two patriarchs, two Catholicoses. One Catholicos is in Ichmiadzin, which is located next to the city of Kars in modern day Armenia, close to Turkey. Now, Ichmiadzin, as a Catholicos seat, was conquered by Russia, annexed by Russia after the 1828 Russo-Persian Wars. So with Nicholas I during the third year of his reign. So it's very interesting. Izmiajin was part of the Russian Empire. So they had an entire Armenian Apostolic See inside of the Russian Empire at some point. So the Russian Empire was essentially almost like the heartland. Well, not the heartland, but it had control over a large portion of the Armenian spiritual sites, whilst Turkey had the other, of course, great patriarchates of both Jerusalem, which the Armenians were, given a right to return to with the Muslim conquest. Justinian did kick the Armenians out of Jerusalem a long time ago, but with the Islamic conquest post reign of Heraclius, they were allowed to enter back into Jerusalem. So now the Armenians are well and truly established there. And the other, of course, major seats were in Kilikia, which is in modern day Lebanon, and of course in Istanbul. And you're like, hold on, what are the Armenians doing in Istanbul? Well, when Mehmed the Conqueror took Constantinople from the Eastern Orthodox Christians, and Emperor Constantine XI was killed. And of course, the siege of the city led to much of the destruction of the current holy sites. Most of the monasteries and churches inside of Constantinople were destroyed. Guess who entered into Istanbul, Constantinople? Of course, the patriarch of the Armenians did. So the Catholicos entered into Constantinople. And since then, the Armenians have had a presence in Istanbul itself. So they have these four major centers. Ichmiadzin apparently are very, shall we say, pro-Russian. So the particular diocese there, the bishops from this province, being heavily under Russian imperial influence for a long time, are Russian. And so I think what Pashinyan's conflict with certain bishops within the church, there are these suspicions arising that, well, maybe there are these bishops in the Armenian church who are still under, so to speak, Russian or maybe even pro-Soviet leaning. So I think it's just Pashinyan trying to distance himself from Russia slowly but surely, trying to edge out any support of any Russian geopolitical, Russian world advocates from among his midst, because we do know Armenians are very ethnocentric, very strongly united around culture, faith, similar to the Georgians, similar, I think, to many other smaller ethnicities around the world. They're very concentrated. And so within that, I think there's a current purge taking place, as we probably hear about from various news stories coming out of the country. And that's very unfortunate news, because if there ever was a reunion of the churches, or shall we say a breach of that schism, it would most certainly come through, not through the Greeks, of course, but through a work collaboration with Russia. So that's, again, a spiritual rift that Pashinyan is contributing to, like the demonic actor that he is, right? This low-key type character. But I would also add, Conrad, that this the recent escalation against Azerbaijan from the Russian side is very obvious. The Russians are not at all coming to the table. Yes, diplomatically speaking, Peskov, Maria Zakharova, for example, Lavrov, they're making very lukewarm statements towards Aliyev. But what we see in reality is actually very curious, because recently the general director, so the CEO, the chief of TASS, and we know TASS as basically the Associated Press it's like the main news source of the Russian state, essentially completely publicly controlled by the Russian government. They report on all the top events happening in Russia. They have inside interviews. Of course, they publish the primary news. I mean, it is a state-controlled news source in Russia, but the director of it, the CEO, was a Jewish man. What appears to be either of Sephardic or Mountain Jewish origins. His name, of course, Mikhail Solomonovich Guzman. He appeared recently in Baku at a press conference with President of Azerbaijan Aliyev, and during the press conference, he was as the leader of the top Russian news agency. He asked Aliyev a question, but it was less of a question, more of a 3-minute praise of Aliyev and his presidency. Very suspicious. I mean, Mikhail Solomonovich Guzman himself or his origins, I think he was born in Baku, but he's essentially travels between Baku and Moscow quite a bit. But it raises the question as to why the CEO of the biggest Russian publicly sourced media agency, Conrad, from 1999 until 2025, was this mountain Jewish fellow. It raises some eyebrows. Again, foreign influence, dual loyalties, or maybe triple loyalties, one to Azerbaijan, one to Israel, one to the Russian Federation. It's an interesting split of attention there. But after this 3-minute interview and his speech that he gave, praising Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, he was fired from TASS. Fired not by anyone, but by Mikhail Mishustin himself, the prime minister of Russia, the second man in charge after President Vladimir Putin. Mikhail Mishustin himself is, just to further bring controversy to the story, is a half Armenian, half Jewish man. So that we have essentially two non-Russians arguing. Mikhail Mishustin signed essentially an executive order firing Mikhail Guzman, although there are claims from certain people in the Russian Jewish community that it had nothing to do with the Ilham Aliyev, and Mikhail Guzman simply wanted to retire himself. But I doubt that very much, because he's been in the same executive position for 26 years now. So since the time of President Putin's ascent to the presidency post Boris Yeltsin. Very curious a situation, but it does show that if Mikhail Mishustin did in fact fire him after the Ilham Aliyev praise comments, that there is a certain view. Mikhail Mishustin, despite being half Jewish, is still very much in the sphere of influence of President Putin, and Putin has been deeply offended by Ilham Aliyev's recent, the arrest of the 7 Russian journalists and tech experts in Baku, which again, they haven't been, I think 2 of them have been in prison, but they haven't really officially even been tried yet. And, they've been accused of drug dealing with Iranian drug dealers. But mind you, how are 7 Russian ethnic white European guys who do not speak Azeri, they do not speak Farsi. How are they supposed to be drug dealers in a land where if you go leave Baku, sure, a lot of people in Baku speak Russian, but if you leave Baku in Azerbaijan, and I agree with me, Maxim Shevchenko, a Russian political analyst on this, if you leave the outskirts of Baku, most general rural Azeris do not speak Russian at all. So how are they supposed to be drug dealing or part of a huge drug ring with the Iranians without knowing any of these Middle Eastern languages? It's really unrealistic. And no Azeri or Iranian or Persian was arrested in the recent purge that the Azeri authorities conducted against these Russian tech experts and journalists. So it very much seems like a political PR move by the Aliyev government. I do note that, of course, President Putin may have been offended personally by Ilham Aliyev, accusing him of not having a strong grasp over his military anti-air defense systems, the ones that shot down that plane traveling over the Caspian Sea to Grozny. That might have been personally offensive to Putin because Putin, although he personally apologized, the state of the Russian Federation never officially released any proclamations that Russia has taken responsibility for the bombing of that plane. So that's very concerning on that, in terms of the bilateral relations between Azerbaijan and Russia are very tense at the moment. And of course, we know a lot of patriotic sort of Z bloggers, a lot of pro-Russian sources online are claiming that Russia needs to go and have a special military operation in Azerbaijan. But I think at this point, first and foremost, the special military operation needs to be taking place inside of Russia itself, because we know how many mountain Jews there are occupying so many key positions in Moscow. There are, as we said on the last episode, there are rumors that up to 40% of the major hotels, supermarkets, such as, even Crocus City Hall itself, the big shopping centers are owned by either Azeris or mountain Jews or people from that region. Like, that is a huge economic influence that these particular tribes people have over the largest city in the Russian Federation, Moscow, 10 million people in population. So super concerning stuff. And, amidst all of this, Conrad, we pivot a bit to Ankara, of course, the peace talks between the Russian and the Ukrainian delegations, and it doesn't look any better over there either. The peace talks ended after about 35, 40 minutes, with Medinsky, the head of the Russian delegation, and Umerov not coming to any agreements. The only thing they agreed on is that there should be an exchange of, I believe it was 1,300 or so prisoners that should be exchanged, and of course an exchange of the bodies of the deceased. So there won't be any meetings between Zelensky and Putin, at least at the moment. There's nothing planned. The Ukrainians, however, they did come to the table, and I think this is the Trump administration pressuring Zelensky and his cabinet to actually start cooperating on the Russo-Ukrainian angle, because they've said that Zelensky openly has said that he wants to meet with Putin at least by the end of August. So by the time this 50-day deadline that Donald J. Trump has set, Zelensky does seem to want to sit at the table of Putin. I think Putin really does not want to meet Zelensky and speak to him in person, because we know Zelensky, most likely he's a better speaker than Putin, and we know he has no shame. The man has played with his private parts on a piano. He's openly going to clown on Putin publicly. He's going to ask him very uncomfortable questions about people like Prigozhin, about organizations such as Rusich. Zelensky is, as much as we like to joke about him, he is a very skilled, devious, Talmudic-style politician. And I don't think Putin, whose reputation hinges on the fact that he doesn't debate anyone, I don't think he wants to sit at a table and have this interaction filmed at all. And I'm not saying Putin's a unskilled politician at all. I just think he's more of a bureaucrat rather than this public-facing man who, like Donald J. Trump, essentially is open to debate Hillary Clinton on stage in front of hundreds of millions of people and openly embarrass her. I think he's a different type of executive leader. So I think it's very interesting how the breakdown in communication essentially leads many geopolitical analysts, Conrad, who speak on Russia and Ukraine, to conclude that the only resolution and the ceasefire and peace will only come through warfare.
Speaking of negotiations that unfortunately don't seem to be going anywhere, this is from Al Jazeera. Iran holds frank nuclear talks with European powers amid sanctions threats. Diplomatic meetings in Istanbul between Tehran and the E3 countries is the first since the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran in mid-June. Of course, the E3 is the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. Iranian diplomats say they held frank nuclear talks with their counterparts from Germany, the UK, and France, as Tehran faces warnings that the three European nations could trigger snapback United Nations sanctions against the country. The meetings in the Turkish capital, Istanbul, which is not actually the Turkish capital, on Friday was the first since Israel's mid-June attack on Iran, which led to an intensive 12-day conflict that saw the United States, launched strikes against key Iranian nuclear sites. Israel's offensive also derailed U.S.-Iran nuclear talks that began in April. Since then, the European powers known as the E3 have threatened to trigger a so-called snapback mechanism under a moribund 2015 nuclear deal that would reinstate UN sanctions on Iran by the end of August. Iran's deputy foreign minister, Kazem Girababadi, who attended Friday's talks alongside senior Iranian diplomat Majid Takht Ravanchi, said that after the meeting, the parties held a serious, frank, and detailed discussion about sanctions relief and the nuclear issue. While seriously criticizing their stances regarding the recent war of aggression against our people, we explained our principled positions, including the so-called snapback mechanism, Girababadi said. It was agreed that consultations on this matter will continue. The European countries, along with China and Russia, are the remaining parties to the 2015 deal, from which the U.S. unilaterally withdrew in 2018. Under the pact known formally as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, Iran had agreed to curb its nuclear program in exchange for global sanctions relief. Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Ismail Baghai said in an earlier interview with state news agency RNA that Tehran considers talk of extending the UN resolution governing the deal, Security Resolution 2231, to be doubly meaningless and baseless. The resolution enshrines the major powers' prerogative to restore UN sanctions. The option to trigger the snapback expires in October, and Tehran has warned of consequences should the E3 opt to activate it. Separately, the IAEA head Rafael Grossi said on Friday that Iran has indicated it will be ready to start technical-level discussions on its nuclear program with the UN nuclear watchdog. Grossi said in Singapore that Iran must be transparent about its facilities and activities. He told reporters that the IAEA had proposed that Iran start a discussion on the modalities as to how to restart or begin inspections again. And in the midst of all of this, the discussions are that basically the E3 is threatening on its own right against sort of on behalf of the United States, who is no longer part of the JCPOA. That's what Trump pulled out of back in his first term after 2016. The Iranians are sort of meeting with them now under the idea that the Europeans may not trigger these sanctions come October. They're sort of extending the date to extend them to October, and the Iranians are hoping that that won't happen. But the threat the Iranians are having that this Al Jazeera article isn't highlighting, Kyle Anzalone talks about it here. It says, Tehran could leave the NPT if Europe reimposes sanctions, which again, Iran is playing ball with the IAEA, which they effectively pulled out of and kicked all the inspectors out of, but they seem to be saying, oh, we'll have you over in some sort of informal capacity. But the threat to Europe, if they do impose these snapback sanctions, is that not only will they stop collaborating with the IAEA, but they'll actually pull out of the NPT altogether, which is, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty that says that, states won't go rogue, they won't adopt nuclear weapons, they won't use nuclear weapons, which, of course, I think Iran would be justified in pulling out of this, considering Israel is not a signatory to it and has actively attacked Iran and is known to maintain a secret and illegal nuclear arsenal of 200 plus weapons. So obviously, I think this is somewhat legitimate. This was, of course, Iran Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Girababadi himself, who's the one negotiating with the E3 on behalf of Iran in regards to these snapback sanctions. He said that Iran would retaliate, including potentially leaving the NPT. Under the treaty, non-nuclear weapon states agree to limit their nuclear programs to civilian purposes. Israel has an undeclared nuclear weapons program. Girababadi is part of the Iranian team currently negotiating with the Europeans. While Tehran has previously threatened to withdraw from the NPT in response to Israeli or American aggression, the Iranian diplomat explained that he was quite confident that if the snapback is triggered, Iran will not show more restraint in this regard. He added that Tehran did not plan to develop nuclear weapons. Iran's policies have not been changed after the aggression. We're even more determined to pursue our policies. And again, Trump is determined to make sure that Iran has zero enrichment, and the Iranians have made it very, very clear that enrichment is, domestically at least, is the pride of their country and something that they're not going to budge on. And this comes amidst all of the major sabotage and obvious Mossad and Israeli internal operations that have been going on against Iran. I wouldn't be surprised if there are even internal drone launches going on here. So the Cold War between these two countries continues. And in the midst of all of this, again, still the main Iranian proxy that's being effective against Israel are the Houthis, but unfortunately, according to the Cradle, the Israelis are planning a major offensive against Yemen and is waiting for a green light from the Israeli political echelon. This is according to Israel's Channel 14, reported on July 23rd. The Israeli security establishment is working around the clock on a major offensive plan against the Yemeni Ansar Allah group, which will put an end to the numerous terrorist incidents and rocket attacks on Israel. We're building capabilities and we will know how to activate them once the political echelon makes a decision, a senior official told the outlet. What we accomplished in 12 minutes in Iran, we will also know how to do in Yemen. The meaning here is that Yemen, which over the past 20 months has been a secondary arena attacked by Israel several times, is now becoming a central arena alongside Gaza and is now an operational priority on the political level and thus within the Israeli military as well. The report followed Defense Minister Israel Katz's statement on Tuesday that there are now two open fronts, the Gaza Strip and Yemen. Israeli officials, including Katz, have been escalating their rhetoric against Yemen in recent weeks as Yemeni armed forces' missile operations continue to frequently target Israel. The article goes on to talk about how the Yemenis basically personally caused the closing down of the Eilat port, and they have struck Ben Gurion Airport before, so they've been very economically damaging to the Israelis, and it seems that they are also heavily lobbying the United States to restart their bombing campaign against Yemen that, of course, Biden ultimately started, but him and Trump were incapable of completely nullifying their capabilities. So between them and the Iranians, and of course the Gazans and West Bank Palestinians, the Israelis are operating on all fronts, doing everything they can. And of course, I still maintain that eventually Israel and Iran will start exchanging missile fire once again. The United States may likely get involved, may do more strikes. There are recent reports that only one of the three facilities that the U.S. struck of the Iranians was actually thoroughly damaged. The Israelis are also now claiming that their strikes damaged Iranian EMP technology. I have no idea exactly how realistic or viable that information is, but that's what's being claimed. But before we talk about some Turkish, Greek, Libya stuff and then move on, to Russia, Ukraine, Dimitri, I'd love to hear what you're thinking about Iran, because again, I do still think we are in an interim period. This 12-day war that we've already experienced will, I think, be seen as an appetizer before I think what we're going to see fairly soon in the future.
Yeah, I think it's quite curious that this week, Conrad, we saw both the Russo-Ukrainian delegation in Ankara, and we saw this nuclear European delegation meeting of the Iranians in Istanbul, literally the two sort of former or present capital cities of Turkey, being occupied by, its high security, high stakes negotiations. And it's also curious that Russia was very much the shadow behind the scenes in the entire Iranian nuclear discussions in Turkey. Why? Well, because both Iran is building Russian nuclear power plants on its territory, or at least, they're planned, at least 3 or 4 are planned in construction at the moment on the coast of the Persian Gulf, as well as Turkey right now is constructing a Rosatom, its first Russian-built nuclear power plant of the highest grade in the Mersin province in Akuya. The Akuya nuclear power plant was, of course, signed as a deal bilaterally between Russia and Turkey in May 2010 with the President Medvedev government, before Putin, of course, came in for his 3rd term. And what's interesting is the Mersin province is located directly across from Cyprus. So when we speak about these eschatological future conflicts, you will have Russian Rosatom scientists, experts, physicists working on this power plant, because this power plant will not be operated by Turks. Russians will have their own nuclear power plant located on Turkish territory, which the Turks will be paying for. So, there's been a lot of criticism from high-end Russian patriots stating that, well, if Turkey is conducting anti-Russian political pushes and anti-Iranian psyops within Syria, why are the Russians building a nuclear power plant for their future enemies, which will fund 10% of all energy across Turkey for its giant population? And raises questions, because it will be 99% Rosatom staffed. And it's very interesting. It does unite sort of Turkey and Iran. They're both reliant on Rosatom. They're both reliant on the Russian Federation's nuclear technology. And it's not surprising that the meeting between the E3, which what's interesting is Garibabadi does call them the Troika, which Troika is a very devious term. It's reminiscent of the Troika 3-panel member tribunals, which took place in the Soviet Union during the NKVD purges and the OGPU persecution of the Orthodox churches. There would be 3-panel members who would, of course, try all these Orthodox priests and bishops, and then, of course, deem them guilty and execute them. So the word Troika literally means something quite bad in Orthodox Christian sort of New Testament traditions. It's quite interesting that the Iranian deputy foreign minister uses that term. It's quite curious. But in any case, Conrad, it does appear that Russia is very much energy bound still to Turkey and even Azerbaijan to some extent. And I think Iranians realize that, and they simply want to perhaps normalize to some extent with, of course, these European partners. Notice the Americans are not part of the E3, right? So there's still, I think, almost a quasi-conspirological angle that maybe the Europeans are acting in some way independently from this hawkish Israeli, Zionist, Trumpish bilateral alliance that's been created there, which is heavily anti-Persian, anti-Iranian. I think the Iranians are just seeking alliances and seeking agreements all around. They're simply feeling out, they're probing for some sort of assistance and understanding from their neighbors. But look, realistically, I don't think they're going to find that in the long term. As you said, Conrad, we are in this interim period, and let's just recall Turkey, Azerbaijan, Syria, all these countries, they all allowed Israeli warplanes and US warplanes to fly without any concerns over their territories to bomb Iran earlier this year during the 12-day war. So I think the Iranians are also aware of this. They're just trying their best to find a way out of this conundrum that they're in energy-wise. And of course, the nuclear talks are one of the best ways for them to do that.
Yeah, and obviously the Yemenis, Hezbollah, as I discussed earlier in the episode, are not wanting to disarm despite this major pressure from the United States. And again, despite Iran, supposedly being more on the defensive, it was revealed last week, we discussed that their strike actually did do damage on the Qatar U.S. base. And now this is from the Long War Journal. The U.S. expresses concern over Iraqi legislation enshrining militias as independent security forces from July 25th. Iraq has revived legislation regarding the Popular Mobilization Authority, the government agency that oversees the Popular Mobilization Forces. The PMF, while legally an Iraqi government security institution, is a conglomeration of militias, and its main constituent elements are backed by Tehran. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio expressed concerns to Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani over the legislation, which he worries would institutionalize Iranian influence and armed terrorist groups, undermining Iraq's sovereignty. While the Trump administration has reportedly been pressuring Baghdad over concerns that the PMF serves as a vehicle for Iranian influence, this has largely occurred out of the public spotlight. In response, Sudani explained that the law is part of the security reform process pursued by the government and is part of the government program approved by the House of Representatives. This process included the approval of similar laws for other agencies within our armed forces, such as the Intelligence and National Security Services, and that the Popular Mobilization Forces is an official Iraqi military institution operating under the authority of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. So obviously, this would be a big boost for Iranian influence in Iraq, showing that, their militias are a major part of the official Iraqi armed forces, and the U.S. is very much trying to prevent this. Remember, the PMF, they launched many missiles at Israel during, the initial escalation of strikes when Hezbollah was also operating more dramatically against Israel, and before Iran, initially did its first strikes and now that it's done 2 big rounds of strikes against Israel, that was, the Iraqi PMF was a big part of that initial force. So Iran, again, they are still very much in play. And despite the fact that they lost many generals and nuclear scientists, they still, I think, maintain the capability to do similar damage to Israeli personnel. And I wouldn't be surprised if when the war begins, we actually do see Israeli generals, Mossad heads and these sorts of things actually targeted, which similar thing goes for Russia, which if Russia wasn't winning, on the front lines so easily, I would also say the same for them. But I think the cauldron strategy, for better or for worse, seems to be how they want to do things there, as opposed to decapitatory strikes on, intelligence heads, generals, these other sorts of things. But considering the Israelis have already gone there, I think the Iranians are very much capable of doing that as well. But before we move on to discussing Russia, Ukraine, of course, in the aftermath of these failed Ankara negotiations, again, we're not really capable of moving past, dead prisoner exchanges and, POW exchanges. We have to talk about the situation with the Mediterranean Sea and Libya, because we don't have much other Africa news today. But this is from Greek Reporter. Greece invites Libya to talks on maritime boundaries migration. Greece has invited Libya's internationally recognized government of national unity in Tripoli. So this is the key to this article here, is Greece is engaging the now on the back foot, ostensibly internationally recognized government of national unity in Tripoli. This is not Haftar's government, and Haftar, of course, is supported by Russia, is ostensibly at certain times has been supported by the United States in the past, and now, as of recent, as we've discussed on previous episodes, is supported by Turkey. So clearly the Greeks have picked up on the fact that Haftar and the Libyan National Army, which is the LNA, which is aligned against the GNU, their base is in Benghazi, the second largest city in Libya. They have now aligned with Turkey. The Greeks have picked up on this and are now aligning themselves, or at least making it clear that they recognize the GNU, the government in Tripoli, as the internationally recognized government in Libya. So this move, announced by Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, aims to mend relations severely strained by a controversial 2019 maritime deal between the GNU and Turkey, which Greece considers illegal and a direct infringement on its sovereign rights, particularly around the island of Crete. So obviously in 2019, the GNU and Turkey were close allies. Russia and Turkey, as we discussed extensively on the show starting back in 2022, had been clashing in a proxy war in Turkey, with Russia supporting the LNA and Turkey supporting the GNU. So Greece obviously would also have been more partial to Haftar. But now that Turkey realized that the LNA is likely to win, I think it's clear the GNU might be driven out of power sometime even this year. The Greeks, I guess, are somehow hoping maybe to bolster support for them with this meeting and, secure something. Now the GNU is likely not happy with Turkey for betraying them. So that might be the Greek endgame here. At the heart of the dispute is the 2019 Memorandum of Understanding between Turkey and the GNU. This MOU mapped out a vast area that disregards the existence and maritime right of Greek islands, including Crete and Rhodes, effectively establishing a corridor between Turkey and Libya. Greece, along with much of the international community, views this agreement as a violation of international law, specifically the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas. And so this, again, relates to something we talk about regularly on the show, which, of course, was something prophesied by St. Paisios, the nautical economic zone border between Turkey and Greece, which would be moved from 12 nautical miles down to 6 nautical miles. Of course, all of this talk with Libya brings up new updates regarding Turkey forming a new maritime planning council to counter Greek marine parks. Turkey has established a marine spatial planning coordination council led by Vice President Cevdet Yilmaz to protect maritime zones and respond to Greece's declaration of marine parks in the Ionian and Aegean seas. The strategic goals of these councils are to defend Turkey's maritime claims and sovereignty, develop marine park strategies via interagency cooperation, and reinforce the Blue Homeland Doctrine, which, again, this is the Turkish doctrine that wants to see the Aegean Sea effectively split down the middle. And obviously with the unstated long-term goal of bringing all of the islands on the eastern side of the Aegean closer to the Turkish coastline into Turkey itself. So that would include Lesbos, obviously all of Cyprus eventually, and many of these other smaller islands. Crete, as is prophesied, Crete will come to be occupied. Lesbos will come to be occupied. Another island will by the Turks in a short battle. So again, this all very much relates to the prophecies we've talked about with St. Paisios and how the Russians will come to be involved. And I thought the Libya news was quite interesting there. But unless you have anything else to say about Turkish influence in the region or anything else about Iran or the Middle East, Dimitri, we do need to move on to the actual front lines in Russia, where, again, it seems on all the major fronts that really matter, going Kherson seems to have sort of fallen to the wayside. But besides that, it's very clear that Russians are moving towards Zaporozhye. They are encircling Pokrovsk. They are advancing into Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov, and the buffer zones in Sumy and other regions farther north are also being maintained. So the front line itself seems to be moving in a positive direction, even if casualties are increasing on both sides.
Certainly right, Conrad. And, just as we look at the front lines and what's happening domestically in both Ukraine and in Russia, there's certainly a lot of tumultuous movings and a lot of big political figures are making major statements. As we stated earlier, Mishustin firing Mikhail Guzman was a huge power play to show that Aliyev was certainly not in favor at the moment, Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, in Russia. But what's curious is Ramzan Kadyrov, we love the Chechen news segment, don't we? Ramzan Kadyrov actually was in Turkey for a holiday at Bodrum. It's a Turkish resort next to Izmir, next to Ephesus, and the island of Rhodes. So very close to Greece, actually, close to that exact area you were just talking about, Conrad. And Ramzan Kadyrov was swimming in the sea. He's 48 years old, by the way, and he nearly drowned. The Turkish Coast Guard had to save him and pull him out of the water. So the leader of the Chechen Republic, right, the commander-in-chief of all these national guards in Chechnya, nearly drowned in a NATO country of Turkey. Firstly, what is he doing in a NATO country, spending his money on a foreign economy? Secondly, shouldn't he be swimming somewhere in the Caspian or Azov or Black Sea? Oh, yeah, lots of quick questions about that, but nevertheless, we shouldn't judge too much. Ramzan Kadyrov is now recovering at a private clinic in Turkey somewhere. So that's very curious. But people choose to have their summer holidays in Europe, especially Russians and Chechens. But in any case, in Russia itself, great news coming out of Pokrovsk. Russian scouts and the Russian, I guess, front lines, it's not stormtroopers, that's quite a malicious term perhaps from World War II, but Shturmoviki, so the frontline infantrymen have for the first time entered into Pokrovsk. The city is not surrounded. So notice we've claimed that perhaps the Russian plan throughout the entire siege of Pokrovsk was to surround the city in its entirety, but the Russians have allowed for 3 main highways to leave out of Pokrovsk, perhaps just like Avdiivka, they're trying to force the Ukrainians like pass out of Assist, for example, to leave the city and to abandon their defenses and not to die in the thousands in this meat grind that's about to ensue. We'll be speaking about further different terrain combats, right? Like in the Middle East, for example, we spoke about earlier, Gaza is very urban-like, and most Russian veterans will agree with me here that urban combat is by far worse than any other. Worse than mountain terrain in Afghanistan, or worse than jungle warfare. Urban terrain warfare is the worst, and this is what the Russians are trying to avoid, I think, in the siege of Pokrovsk. They're trying to scare the Ukrainians back with the successful assaults from the northeastern side, essentially entering into the city for the first time. And just like most media, the West is crying now. They're saying Pokrovsk is the great siege of 2025. That the Russians are going to kill innocent people. They're going to torture them, etc. The claims of tortured Ukrainians is, of course, coming out of the Donetsk Oblast. There's recently been quite a curious report that one of the biggest mines close to Pokrovsk in the Donetsk Oblast, which was, shall we say, taken by Russia a long time ago. It was one of the most successful mines. Like, we know the Donbass region in and of itself is known for its coal mines, all kinds of mineral ores. And this particular mine, called Shakhta Zasyadka, next to Donetsk, between Donetsk and Pokrovsk, was hit by 4 consecutive Ukrainian HIMARS strikes. So you imagine there's a mine center, there's obviously civilians working there, so the Ukrainians smashed 4 HIMARS missiles into that mine. For what reason? Unknown, but apparently Ukrainians have been claiming that the Russians haven't been mining in the shaft at all. They've been actually using it to torture Ukrainian soldiers and prisoners of war, which I doubt very much. The Russians wouldn't be doing this in some sort of abandoned mine shaft. Again, it's like the Orcs of Mordor sort of narrative, that the mines of Moria sort of, this narrative of goblins and things like that is being pushed unnecessarily. And if true, and if there were Ukrainian prisoners held in the mine, why would the Ukrainians shoot HIMARS missiles consecutively 4 times, which is quite excessive, into this particular civilian economic enterprise? It's apparently one of the richest mines in all of Donbass. So interesting that the Ukrainians are destroying their own future economy, which they seek to liberate in those eastern regions of Ukraine. So quite contradictory there, isn't it? But besides Pokrovsk, which was a great success for the Russians, and the Russians are advancing, trying to force the Ukrainians back, there's also rumors that the Russians are going to push up north next to where the Kharkovskaya Oblast meets the Luganskaya Oblast in Kupiansk, and of course Liman in that direction, where my uncle is currently serving, somewhere between the Donetsk and Luganskaya Oblast in that particular region, closing in on, of course, the much needed cities of Izyum, Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk, which the Ukrainians are heavily reinforcing. Potentially, Conrad, we're looking at a giant cauldron which the Russians are going to form once they take Pokrovsk, which is the most important city at the moment on the entire stretch of the front lines, after the liberation of Sudzha, of course, earlier this year. And from Pokrovsk, you can draw this massive half crescent swooping up north all around to Kupiansk. If the Russians can manage to surround the Ukrainian army being held there, and they force them into a surrender or a tactical strategic retreat, almost the entirety of the Donetsk Oblast will be liberated. And one of the goals of the special military operation will in fact be met. So I think it would be a huge humanitarian victory as well, because it would result in minimal casualties from both sides, rather than besieging Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Izyum head on, like in Bakhmut, as Yevgeny Prigozhin called it, a meat grinder, which it generally was. And I think he was one of the men technically responsible for that strategy in Bakhmut itself, despite, of course, the necessity of taking that city. I would greatly, I think, dispute the fact that you need to smash thousands of Russian Slavs against Ukrainian Slavs head on into one another. I think that's a very, shall we say, almost BC level hoplite strategy, which really is quite bloodthirsty. But in any case, the Ukrainians, of course, are using the drone armies, which I think Yuri Yevich reported that the Russians and the Ukrainians have about 2 million drones active now on either side, which is insane. The Ukrainians, he claimed, have a bit more, 2,200,000 drones, and they're constantly producing more. So more drones than there are troops, which is absolutely insane. And the Ukrainians are sending drones at Russian oil refinery facilities to try and hurt the Russian economy in oblasts like Smolenskaya Oblast, Saratov, Rostov, and of course Belgorod itself. So just over the border, the drones typically fly at night, so they're quite hard to spot if they switch all of their lights off. You can only hear them, but if they fly at a high enough altitude, it's really difficult to spot them at night. We know this because, of course, even during Operation Desert Storm in 1990, Kuwait and Iraq, the US, of course, always struck the Iraqis at nighttime. That is when you fly your planes and drones and other technology over, enemy fortifications to try and bomb them or and key other strategic points. So nighttime attacks are definitely the name of the game, even today in 2025, 35 years removed. And speaking about the Russian military-industrial complex, Conrad, I think a really important news story is that one of the Russian admirals, I think he was the chief admiral of the Pacific Navy, he made a very strange statement. He stated that the Russian aircraft carrier, Russia only has one aircraft carrier left over from the USSR, that is the Admiral Kuznetsov, which had a little cameo appearance in the recent Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise. But the Admiral Kuznetsov, since the Syrian civil war, since 2016-17, has been undergoing severe repairs in Russia. These repairs have cost over 20 billion rubles, which may amount to, I think, a few hundred American dollars, but it's been undergoing repairs and renovations. And these repairs, 7 years later, have still not concluded, so that we haven't actually seen the Admiral Kuznetsov in action for about 7 years now. And this particular admiral from the Pacific, chief of the Russian fleet, he openly stated that the aircraft carrier needs to be scrapped. It's quite an interesting conclusion, despite the fact that he said that the Kuznetsov is too old. It's about 40 years of age, 42 years old, from 1983. But if you look at the majority of the American aircraft carriers, Conrad, including the USS Carl Vinson, they're all made in the 80s as well. All the aircraft carriers that America has, besides a few of them, were made in that 1980s, late Cold War 1990s period. So the Kuznetsov actually isn't that old. It needs to be renovated, I think, really. And I dispute the Admiral's findings. I think Russia needs an aircraft carrier, even to train their pilots to land aircraft and fighter bombers and planes onto the aircraft carrier, which takes months, if not years, of training in the Air Force. Like, you need this just for the sake of experience, if not for anything else. You shouldn't scrap the aircraft carrier or sell it to some other country. They're saying that potentially they'll sell it to another nation who sell it to Thailand, Indonesia, or India. I'm sure they'd love to buy the Admiral Kuznetsov and repair it, but I think Russia will be losing a major asset, especially with the coming wars in the Arctic and the necessity to have these major naval confrontations, potentially going into the really hot phase of the Third World War. So very unfortunate. But domestically in Ukraine, Conrad, we've seen some giant protests against Zelensky. People are calling Zelensky a demon. Ukrainian liberal protesters, mind you, because Zelensky has been cracking down on anti-corruption institutions within Ukraine. These institutions, like NABU, for example, and have been targeting Ukrainian politicians, many members of Zelensky's party and his cabinet, accusing them of corruption, stealing money, etc. We know how many hundreds of billions of dollars have been flowing into through Ukraine. There's obviously a huge need for auditing, and these organizations like NABU have been targeted by Zelensky. And he's kind of rolled that back after the protests, because he said that, look, it's just these organizations need to be controlled by the executive arm of the branch of the Ukrainian cabinet, which would mean that why would the cabinet investigate itself? So clearly Zelensky is trying to bring this whole corruption scandal a little bit down. Unfortunately, it does seem like NABU has been led by most likely American corruption experts from the beginning. It was, I think, created during the Poroshenko years, and it was created by American experts. So it seems like Zelensky is really fighting to preserve his image as this truly democratic Ukrainian president, rather than a thief and a corrupt fraudster, which I think is curious. But in any case, we do see Ukrainian citizens, coming out to the streets protesting, mostly young people, mostly young women who haven't been conscripted as well, I know, and mostly not old people who really have no cares in the world for auditing or corruption. But these young folks in Ukraine are protesting against Zelensky, and the protests ranged all the way from Kiev, Cherkasy, Lvov, Kharkov, all these major big cities. So it's quite good to see the Ukrainian people actually coming out and finally attacking Zelensky for something, which I think is, we haven't seen them protest against the persecution of the church as heavily as they are, against this corruption business. But in any case, even this little drop in the bucket will be good, I think, for the eventual downfall of that Kiev terrorist regime. So in any case, that's fortunate. But I'll have to mention this one bit of news, Conrad, from domestically in Russia. This is related to the war effort because it also targets the frontline men who are posting very base things online. It's a 3.5-minute clip coming out from the MVD, the Domestic Affairs Unit of Russia, which essentially looks after the police. This is one of the major institutions in Russia. They released a 3.5-minute clip which targets and essentially accuses all Russian nationalist organizations of being somehow related to neo-Nazism and fascism. They show really outdated clips from the early 2000s of Russian skinheads throwing up Sieg Heil salutes. They show these black, yellow, white flags accusing Russian imperialists of being somehow chauvinistic, being against illegal immigration. The video itself claims that Russian nationalists are a danger to the integrity of the Russian Federation. And again, they're a danger to the multicultural society, which is Russia. So again, it's a crackdown similar to what we spoke about with Ivan Vorobyevsky, in a crackdown against, I guess, Russian patriotism, true Russian nationalism, which is generally a Russian tradition going back to Tsar Nicholas II, Mendeleev, Stolypin, and all of those great people, Menshikov, etc., who actually tried to bolster Russian statehood in that pre-World War I, pre-Russian Revolution era. And of course, most of those people were murdered and martyred by the Bolsheviks. So Russian nationalism very much is a threat, according to certain people in the Russian government. And they're openly stating that in their clips, which they're releasing on the MVD website, the official website itself. It's not crafted by any foreign agents. It's officially, up there. And this is incredibly concerning. So Ivan Vorobyevsky discussion regarding the criminalization of Article 282 of the Russian Criminal Code, the crackdown on Russian nationalism within the country in a strange way, because most of these Russian nationalists are actually so pro-Russian, they're anti-Ukrainian to the bone. Like, we're talking, they don't like Ukraine as a liberal state, as a quasi-Marxist state. They're, of course, against the renaming of a lot of these classical Russian imperial cities like Bakhmut into Artyomovsk or Pokrovsk. They're trying to rename Pokrovsk into Krasnoarmeysk, which is, I guess, like Red Army. Like, the name Pokrovsk will be renamed, which is sad because Pokrovsk is named after, of course, the intercession of the Theotokos in Constantinople, which the intercession of the protection of the Theotokos feast day. That's what the city is named after. Renaming it to some Red Army Bolshevik symbol is very inappropriate. I don't think it will spell and request God's favor in this greater Third World War. So hopefully the Russians will awaken to the internal machinations, which I think are being forced by people like Mikhail Guzman, who ran TASS for 26 years and censored that Metropolitan Neofestos interview from February 2024, where he removed all the references to Zelensky being a Khazarian, etc. So very interesting. I think we'll keep covering this news domestically in Russia because it does impact what's happening on the front lines, very much so, because a lot of these Russian veterans are returning home and they are becoming very orthodox, very catechized, very right-wing. So this, of course, is contributing to the Russian rejuvenation.
Yeah, with Guzman, he fell for the Neophytos curse, which perhaps, Archbishop Georgios might be falling for the same thing soon. But as far as the Russia-Ukraine situation goes, I think the most encouraging frontline report I have recently, and this was just yesterday as of this recording, Russian forces, of course, have entered Stepnogorsk, capturing the Stepnogorsk Children's Music School in the Zaporozhye direction. Russian troops are now less than 23 kilometers from Zaporozhye city. So I can imagine from the tallest building within Zaporozhye, you might be able to see some smoke and some things in the distance, depending on the topography. So very interesting development. I remember, things have gotten closer and closer to Kharkov city at many points during the war. It appears that, that is about to be occurring for Zaporozhye, which again is one of Ukraine's largest cities at one point, 750,000 people. So again, I'm very curious as to what the Russian plan is to secure this city with minimal losses, because this is going to be a place that has more civilians than any other area that they've attempted to liberate in multiple years at this point over the course of this war. And of course, you mentioned, Dmitry, the Pokrovsk direction, which obviously right now is probably the most important strategic point that is on the verge of falling to the Russians. But as far as the United States support for the war effort goes, unfortunately, Trump has made it very clear that he is trying to ramp up his support for Ukraine. He's recently approved a series of arms deals for Ukraine totaling $652 million, including $150 million for Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, $172 million for a Hawk Phase 3 surface-to-air missile, as well as related equipment and training, $150 million for the maintenance and refurbishment of an M109 self-propelled howitzer, $180 million for the sale of sustainment of U.S.-provided air defense equipment. The government of Ukraine has requested to buy equipment and services to support the training, sustainment, and refurbishment measures for existing U.S. origin air defense systems. It's unclear if Ukraine will actually be paying for each arms deal itself or if it will be funded by U.S. military aid. President Trump recently announced a plan to pour billions of dollars worth of additional U.S. military equipment into Ukraine that would involve NATO allies purchasing the weapons, but it's also unclear if that is related to the arms sales announced recently by the DSCA. The Pentagon had recently announced that it had paused certain arms shipments to Ukraine, but President Trump appeared to be caught off guard by the announcement, and the weapons deliveries quickly resumed. Trump has given Russia a 50-day deadline to reach a peace deal in Ukraine, threatening that he would impose tariffs on Russia and its trading partners if the war doesn't end by then. But Moscow is undeterred and has made it clear that it's ready to continue fighting and achieve its goals, which that coincides pretty clearly with Peskov's statements after the Ankara talks that Russia definitely was downplaying any sort of success coming out of them. He said that's exactly why our armed forces are taking all necessary measures to establish buffer zones and, more importantly, to eliminate the military and paramilitary infrastructure of the Ukrainian regime. Overall, Moscow downplayed the success of the negotiations. The third round of Russia-Ukrainian negotiations was predictably difficult and by far not merely technical. It was clear from the very beginning that the sides will continue efforts toward a peace agreement without any breakthroughs, explained Leonid Slutsky, chairman of the International Committee of the Duma. As Russia's chief negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, said the positions of the sides are far from being close, but dialogue continues. President Zelensky said the Ukrainian delegation proposed an unconditional ceasefire. Moscow has a long-standing refusal to a ceasefire unless a deal to end the war is nearly completed. Zelensky said Moscow's refusal of the ceasefire should lead to new sanctions on Russia. Russia continues its terror and obstructs diplomacy, which is why it deserves full-scale sanctions responses, as well as our strikes on their logistics, their military bases, and their military production facilities. President Donald Trump has threatened to impose secondary tariffs on countries that do business with Russia if Moscow does not end the war by the end of August, which most dramatically would be India and China. And of course, recent reports have also come out about North Korea providing, I think, 40+% of all of the ammunition the Russians are using within Russia. But at this point, other East Asian countries, sort of aware of these looming conflicts merging with China, everything going on in Thailand and Cambodia, which we're going to talk about in a second, and of course, Japan wanting to remilitarize. They're realizing the only military in the entire region that has any experience fighting in modern warfare are these North Koreans. And apparently the North Koreans are interested on a personal training level of sending more and more troops to Russia. So I don't know the current status of the North Korean troops. I don't know if they have actually entered the proper Ukrainian front lines outside of Kursk and these other regions, but I wouldn't be surprised if we potentially saw some of that coming down the pipe soon. But unless you have anything else to say about the front lines, Dmitry, I want to talk about this other fascinating piece of news from Russia and Belarus. And this is this new law. This says here in a landmark move underscoring the deepening integration between Moscow and Minsk. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a law on July 23rd that grants Belarusian citizens permanently residing in Russia the right to vote in elections and run for municipal office. The law marks a symbolic and strategic step in advancing the decades-old union state project between the two nations and reflects a broader ideological ambition, the resurrection of pan-Slavic unity, and the restoration of Soviet-era influence. The legislation updates a 1998 bilateral agreement on mutual rights, aligning civic privileges for Russian and Belarusian citizens in each other's countries. It mirrors existing Belarusian laws that already grant Russian nationals similar rights to vote and participate in local elections. According to state media, Putin framed the measures as a way to integrate Belarusians more fully into Russia's civic and political life, but the move is far more than administrative. It signals a continued drive toward the full implementation of the Union State Treaty, signed in 1999, which envisions not only aligned political and legal systems, but potentially a shared currency, joint defense, and unified foreign policy. So we've discussed extensively on the show how a post-Lukashenko Belarus that is not, cleaved away from Russia to the West will fundamentally, I think, just rejoin Russia. And it's clear that this is just another step in that direction. But unless you have anything else to say about Russia, Ukraine, Dmitry, I'm probably ready to move on to Cambodia and Thailand, the big new war.
Yes, absolutely. I agree entirely, Conrad, with you. And it will depend, of course, as to who will outlast whom in Russia and Ukraine. And of course, not just Russia and Ukraine, but Belarus as well. Like which country will have a change in leadership as to exactly how they will integrate. Hopefully Lukashenko has in fact worked with Putin on reintegrating the two states. And in fact, they're moving forward with it because there are Russian nuclear missiles now positioned in Belarus. Belarus is essentially a safe haven for all Eastern European, especially Orthodox Christians. So that is a great move going forward. And hopefully Russians will have a chance those Russians residing in Belarus will have a chance to vote in those local elections as well. And there'll be a full mutual collaboration going forward. So I'm quite glad Lukashenko and Putin have agreed to this. This is a really big move going forward. And very importantly, the state of Thailand and Cambodia, which is the next front of the Third World War, which has really opened up by surprise. And symbolically, again, as most of these fights take place on a spiritual level, there is a spiritual aspect to it. Both nations of Cambodia and Thailand are constitutional monarchies. Both are heavily Buddhist. And the fighting, of course, that broke out this week, just a few days ago, has occurred around the Buddhist temple sites. So these are sites which I think most Christians, Catholics, Protestants, and also Orthodox Christians would refer to as pagan temples, right? Located in these jungles of Cambodia and Thailand, and of course disputed territories. Most of these temples, again, have been located officially according to the borders drawn between Thailand and its neighbor Cambodia in the southeast are, as by the French experts, of course, in the 20th century, most of these temples are located on Cambodian territory, but they live right next to the Thai borders and right next to Thai military encampments as well. So the first temple that was necessarily affected, and this is at the crux of the fighting, is the Tham Muon Thom temple. Now, the Tham Muon Thom, essentially, both sides claim that, again, their opponent was the first to incite some sort of conflict around the temple. For example, the Cambodians are claiming that the Thai have opened up their base gates. They've took some troop carriers. They've positioned barbed wire and defensive positions surrounding the Cambodian temple on the Cambodian territory just across the border. It's literally a few kilometers away from the Thai border, and they've occupied this Cambodian territory, this Buddhist temple, which is probably thousands of years old at this point. Whilst the Thai are actually accusing the Cambodians of firstly firing at Thai positions near the temple, of course, firing at the Thai military bases and injuring civilians, and therefore the Thai infantry needed to cross the border in terms of securing defensive positions. At the moment, it's not quite clear, Conrad, as to who exactly started the conflict, but it has been raging for the last 2 days nonstop. And at this point, we can clearly say there are tens of deceased on both sides, tens of killed infantrymen and Marines. And the Marines aspect comes in very interestingly, because if you look at the border between Cambodia and Thailand, they do share a naval maritime border as well in the southwest. In particular, the Thai Navy has been actively trying to stop any Cambodian encroachments over the Thai border in the southwest of the country. So Thailand does have a very powerful, potent navy, one of the strongest navies in Southeast Asia after Singapore, Indonesia, of course, China itself, and Vietnam. So Thailand definitely shouldn't be looked at as a country which is somehow falling behind its neighbors. If anything, Thailand, there's this ancient kingdom of Siam, which Nicholas II has visited many times in the early 20th century, has kept up with its neighbors in terms of military capacity. And if you look at the troops, like fighting on either side, the Cambodians, Conrad, they're very much dressed in, kind of homemade khaki gear. A lot of them are shirtless because it is hot at this time in that central equatorial zone. It is very much jungle warfare. The Cambodians are wearing, as you said, flip-flops, sandals. The Thai military mostly is dressed in American-made uniforms, where they have night vision goggles on some of the elite troops. They have American-made troop carriers, tanks, very, very Western style, very, very much geared to the teeth, whilst the Cambodians are very much in, I don't want to say Vietnam War era phase equipment, but at least the troops positioned on the border who were engaging in the fighting, it appears that they were very much unprepared for what was about to ensue. And this is why most of them are haphazardly fighting the Thai military again with what appears to be in an unprepared fashion. Again, we haven't seen the official Cambodian military full force enter into the combat. We haven't seen any Air Force deployments by helicopters across either border of the nation, but we are having light infantry warfare. Again, there are actual trenches in the jungles between the two nations. There are, of course, mountainous terrains. It's quite complex warfare, similar to Myanmar, in fact, which is just to the northwest of Thailand as well. And again, it throws this hypothesis into the mix, Conrad, who exactly is behind the conflict between Thailand and Cambodia, because we know historically Thailand, the kingdom of Siam, has always been pro-Western sort of country. Initially, it was pro-Russian before the Russian Revolution, very much friendly to Nicholas II. In fact, all Buddhists around the world viewed Nicholas II as the white Tsar. All the lamas, including Dalai Lama himself, loved Nicholas II. They loved the Russian Tsars. But as the Russian Empire fell, I think most of these Buddhist nations, they looked around the world as to who to align with, because they didn't like the communists. So they aligned, unfortunately, with the only power that was really left, and that was somewhat amicable, which was the West, in particular America. And so Thailand, very much American-orientated, whilst Cambodia as well, both America and China-orientated, quite a mixture there, of course, given their quasi-communist heritage in the past as well. Unfortunately, the Marxism has ingrained itself in a lot of these Southeast Asian nations. And I think one of the theories, Conrad, that people are throwing out is that Thailand potentially would have been making a pivot either towards BRICS or towards multipolarity, maybe even towards China, and trying to escape this bind that it was in, supporting, again, America during the Vietnam War, supporting the US, supporting globalism. And because Thailand was trying to make this pivot away from, say, a unipolar world, maybe trying to join in this greater multipolar project, this is why the war was provoked, in order to destabilize Thailand, because if you look at a map, if you look at the military mights of both these countries, Cambodia is very much a Ukraine and Thailand is very much a Russian Federation in terms of mutual strengths. Thailand is much richer. Cambodia relies on Thailand to a large extent in terms of selling its goods. The Cambodian laborers cross the border every single week to work in Thailand to earn higher wages, just like Malaysian employees and laborers cross into Singapore to earn higher wages in Singapore. This is just how Southeast Asian economies essentially work with these close bilateral relations. But who provoked whom is what would I think lead us to conclude as to who's behind the conflict in and of itself. Is this a proxy war between the US and China? Is Russia somehow involved? Is India, for example, there was suspicions that India was somehow involved in the Myanmar conflict, or through its ally Russia. But at the moment, Conrad, it does appear that Thailand is winning out in this 2-day. At this point, we'll be recording in the 3rd day of this conflict, in this very interesting strategic fight between the two nations. And for all those doubting that we aren't in the Third World War, I suggest just look at the map and all the varied, distinct conflicts taking place. The world is very, very well and truly being divided up amongst ethnic religious lines, and even amongst co-religionists, both Cambodia and Thailand being deeply Buddhist, right, going back hundreds, thousands of years at this point. Even they are disagreeing amidst the current World War conflicts with borders that simply do not logically align amongst ethnic lines. So it's really quite curious.
No, I find this to be a very fascinating conflict. And we did talk about some of the disputes and brief skirmishes and happenings in the past few weeks that did lead up to this. This isn't something that necessarily completely caught us off guard, but we didn't necessarily think it would erupt to this level. At this point, it's been raging longer than even Operation Sindoor, I think, is going to have once all said and done. So this is quite an interesting development. But to understand these two countries in general, which aren't as much in the public eye and as much in the sort of broader lexicon of what we talk about on the show, they are both, of course, constitutional monarchies. They have very heavy influences from the military, much like other neighboring countries like Myanmar, which of course is in the midst of a civil war that obviously is going to come into play. You got to remember Thailand being it's sort of the anchor of this region. You've got Malaysia with a lot of people to the south, and you've got Vietnam being the real population hub in Indochina. But Thailand is right next to it, 70 plus million people. So it's kind of the next population powerhouse. Then you got Myanmar with 60 million. So that whole area is very, powerful and, economically relevant. And these places have extreme influences from their military juntas. In 2003 and 2014, the Thai military, I think with the support of the monarchy, overthrew the democratically elected prime ministers who had been influenced by the National Endowment for Democracy, U.S. influence, and had basically just been selling Thailand out effectively to the West. And people have always been pointing out that, Thailand is listed as a major non-NATO ally of the U.S. That was in 2003, right before that prime minister was couped out by the military. There was another coup in 2014, has since secured Thailand much more close relations with China. There is high-speed rail connecting Thailand and China, which Cambodia does not yet have. However, looking at the weapons that both sides are using in this conflict, Cambodia is relying much more on Chinese weapons, whereas Thailand, they have F-16 fighter jets, M16 rifles from the United States, all sorts of equipment, but they also have recently acquired a lot of equipment from the Chinese as well. But this conflict largely started as well and was sort of bolstered and supported in Thailand when the currently also unpopular prime minister, who I think it's a somewhat similar situation in Thailand, if you're noticing a pattern, democracy, the stupid liberal processes that have been introduced in these countries, imposed on them by the West, are utilized by Western powers, the United States and others, to influence them negatively against their domestic heritage institutions, the military, the monarchy. And in many ways, similar things have been happening in Cambodia. Hun Sen is sort of informally leading Cambodia as a sort of dictator, even though there is a monarch. He's the president of the Senate. His son is the prime minister, and he sort of controls the situation that way. But the prime minister, now unpopular prime minister in Thailand, was leaked on tape saying that the escalating tensions on the border as Cambodia mined the Thai border and troops have been getting their limbs blown off and skirmishes had happened. She basically blamed the Thai military in a conversation with the Cambodians. So this led to outrage in the public. among the Thai people. And now at this point, the war is, again, it isn't just raging across the borders with these big skirmishes, but major segments of territory have been taken. And there's many other reports like this at this point, but this was from the first day of the conflict. The Thai military troops have crossed into Cambodia and have captured the Preah Vihear Temple, as well as Route 62, Thai-Cambodian border crossing points. So they're immediately taking these temples, these temple sites, these holy areas, all sorts of places. It's confirmed they've, I think, at this point taken well over 75, at this point, at least over 100 square kilometers of Cambodian territory. You mentioned earlier, Dimitri, the Cambodian, or rather the Thai Navy getting involved. That was because you mentioned that a maritime border, Thailand, the Trak province of Thailand, sort of shoots down, and there's sort of peninsular exclaves with, basically opportunities to where if the Cambodians seized a lot of areas across the border, they'd be able to completely separate certain Thai regions and cities from the rest of Thailand. So that was why the Thai Navy got involved. They prevented Cambodian military forces from achieving that goal, which would have, again, for the fact that Cambodia doesn't have a super powerful navy or really much of an air force at all, it would have been something that they'd be capable of doing. And of course, like you said, Thailand, with their F-16s and their aircraft carrier, obviously have a big advantage against the Cambodians. However, the Cambodians do have more tanks, and they have a lot of multiple launch rocket systems and other things that would benefit their infantry on the ground that really will allow them in the jungle fighting, perhaps where air forces aren't going to be able to be as effective, which we know they are effective in these parts of the world, unfortunately for the Cambodians. But in places where they may be less effective, the Cambodians are going to be able to reach and have parity with the Thai forces on the ground in some capacity. Obviously, the question is, will there be any Chinese involvement? Will there be any U.S. involvement? I think both sides are trying to somewhat call for peace at this point. Trump was posting about it, trying to call both sides to a ceasefire, saying they both desire it. The Malaysians have been called in as well. And the Malaysian prime minister is saying that he also thinks there's desire for a ceasefire, but both sides continue to fight. There are at this point dozens of sort of fronts, which seems like it's going to be a little bit harder to put this one back in the box. And I'm wondering, again, the motivating factors. We're going to learn more about that. I recommend everybody watch Brian Berletic's recent video on the New Atlas on YouTube about this. He lives in Thailand, so he talks about this. But I have a few reports here about some of the conflict. It's interesting, new front. So I want to give people a picture. This is an archived article from Reuters. Thai fighter jets bomb Cambodian targets as border battle escalates. Thailand scrambled an F-16 fighter jet to bomb targets in Cambodia on Thursday after artillery volleys from both sides killed at least 11 civilians as border tension boiled over into rare armed conflict between the Southeast Asian countries. Both blamed each other for starting the morning clash at a disputed area of the border, which quickly escalated from small arms fire to heavy shelling in at least 6 locations, 209 kilometers apart along a frontier where sovereignty has been disputed for more than a century. Thailand positioned 6 F-16 fighter jets in an uncommon combat deployment, one of which was mobilized to strike a Cambodian military target, among measures Cambodia's foreign ministry called reckless and brutal military aggression. Thailand's military said the use of air power was to strike with precision. The worst fighting between the countries in 13 years came after Thailand on Wednesday recalled its ambassador to Phnom Penh and expelled Cambodia's envoy in response to a second Thai soldier losing a limb to a landmine that Bangkok alleged had been laid recently by rival troops. The two countries have been braced for conflict since the killing of a Cambodian soldier late in May during a brief skirmish, with troops reinforced on both sides of the border amid a full-blown diplomatic crisis that brought Thailand's fragile coalition government to the brink of collapse. We discussed that Cambodian soldier being killed on World War Now when it happened, if anyone remembers. Thailand said there were 12 fatalities in 3 Thai provinces, 11 of them civilians, including an 8-year-old boy. Authorities said 31 people were injured on Thursday. The number of Cambodian casualties was unclear. We condemn this, using heavy weapons without a clear target outside of conflict zones. The use of force did not adhere to international law, Thailand's acting prime minister Phumtham Wechayachai told reporters. We remain committed to peaceful means that there should be discussions, but what happened was a provocation and we need to defend ourselves. So obviously both sides have been hesitant to declare full-on war, but they have declared martial law in pretty much all of the border regions. Cambodia, I think, has also openly used cluster munitions and admitted to it, not thinking they're doing anything wrong. So this is a very serious military conflict. I'm seeing a lot of images and footage of damage. It's very serious. So we need to definitely pray for peace and safety here. But it does seem that both sides are willing to escalate. I've seen the troops are following orders on both sides. There don't seem to be much objection to what is going on here. So they do seem somewhat motivated, the population, to maybe retake some of these temples and whatnot. So I think it's a fascinating conflict that we're going to keep seeing. And again, something else that recently happened that is going to make it a lot harder for them to achieve peace this broke a few moments before we started recording. Major General Doang Somnyang, the commander of the Royal Cambodian Army's 7th Division, was reportedly killed earlier today by an artillery shell fired by the Thai army. It happened during a failed counterattack by Cambodia near the border areas of Phu Ma Kwai and Chong Tai Thao, which were captured this morning by Thai forces. This marks the first reported death of a flag officer since the cross-border conflict between Cambodia and Thailand began on Thursday. So now that a high-level officer has been killed, the Cambodian forces, I think, are going to be more motivated to reciprocate those kinds of losses onto the Thai forces. But again, the Thai forces seem to be the only ones actively able to hold territory within Cambodia. They seem to have been successful at repelling some of Cambodia's more clever, perhaps premeditated attacks, and they also seem to be actively controlling the airspace with their F-16s. I'm not sure the status of Cambodia's air defenses. Perhaps they have some, but I know for a fact that they don't have any fighter jets that are going to be able to launch any sort of similar sorties into Thai territory. So we're going to keep watching this for sure. As far as my analysis on what I think is happening behind the scenes, my guess seems to sort of be that perhaps this was provoked, perhaps the U.S. maybe prompted Cambodia to provoke this, as well as prompting sort of their proxies within Thailand to sow distrust of the Thai military and the monarchy. We see this report from Reuters, which is emphasizing the F-16 strikes and perhaps the Thai military's brutality. Maybe the idea is to paint Thailand as, being too heavy-handed against the weaker Cambodia, and that the military and the monarchy need to be overthrown, and Thailand needs to, become a more friendly player and deal more with international human rights. This comes amidst sanctions relief, actually, that has been granted to the Myanmar junta, they begged basically Trump for sanctions relief, and Trump basically delivered it for them. So I don't know if this means that Myanmar might be coming to the table on some kind of deal, or if there is, normalization coming around the corner, if maybe Trump is interested in toning down the U.S.'s support for the ongoing civil war within Myanmar. But when you think about it this way, if this is sort of a broader international pressure campaign against Thailand, you now have the war in Cambodia, you have the raging civil war on the massive Thai-Myanmar border. You, of course, have, I believe there are Malay-backed separatists in the south of Thailand. So Thailand is in many ways surrounded and facing pressure on all sides. And we know it was one of these countries that was never fully colonized. And the fact that it still maintains its monarchy and its military seems to act, much like Myanmar, which is in the situation that it's in because its military junta overthrew a Western-backed puppet, NED installed, prime minister who won a sort of rigged election. The junta then overthrew things because, in these countries, the military sort of maintains a sort of traditional maintenance role of the state. Thailand, Cambodia allow a lot of these countries still sort of have this situation going on. But right now it seems that the Malaysian prime minister, in conjunction with Donald Trump and potentially with the Chinese, are the ones that are going to be talking to try to mediate this ceasefire. But before we talk about anything else going on in East Asia and a few other pieces of news and church news as well, I'd love to hear any other thoughts you have on this conflict, which we are going to be covering until, it has a ceasefire or, it escalates into something else.
Yeah, first and foremost, Conrad, you said correctly that Thailand has very delicate borders. Obviously, there's an heavily Islamic population in Malaysia, of course, in the southeast. If you look at the borders of Thailand, they're very confusing. They're very sensitive as well. That 2,400-kilometer border it shares with Myanmar is a point of contention, I think, for Thailand. A very stressful point because Myanmar is experiencing a huge civil war, and it has been for a few years now. Just keeping in mind that 2,400-kilometer border that Thailand shares with Myanmar, how is it divided between the junta, the sort of regime that's in power now in Myanmar, and the ethnic groups, the various, shall we say, the liberation forces, as they call themselves, the Karen National Union. So 1,600 kilometers are held by the junta. So that's who Thailand has to deal with, the majority of its border, which is, I think, quite comfortable for them, at least officially, to deal with an authoritarian regime on the other side. But close to 800 kilometers are of Thailand border with Myanmar are controlled by these various ethnic quasi-terroristic groups who are fighting against the regime in Myanmar. So that's quite concerning. 800 kilometers of border. Essentially, if you can imagine, the Thai army most likely has tens of thousands of troops positioned along that border, just as they were in Cambodia. They have to remain there in the northwest holding that border. They will not be, of course, sent to assist against Cambodia in the southeast, no matter what happens. So at this point, that on some level equalizes the power disparity, at least in terms of ground troops between the two nations. But as you said, Conrad, the air superiority of Thailand is absolutely overwhelming. Although we do know, like Operation Red Wings, for example, Operation Anaconda in Afghanistan, when the Taliban did take down certain American helicopters, and it is possible for a air force-less regime, even for example the 5-day war in South Ossetia between Georgia and Russia, in that saw, of course, the Georgians take down several Russian aircraft, right, with anti-air missiles. So it is possible for Cambodia to fight back against an overwhelmingly powerful air force, but it's the domination of the air is a huge factor, which we know the Israelis abuse in the Middle East. So it'll be very interesting to see exactly how Myanmar plays into all of this, given its huge territorial linkage to Thailand and the instability going on there, as well as what will be China's official position on the conflict, Conrad. Who will they stand behind, Thailand or Cambodia, given that, yes, Cambodia potentially could have been pressured by the US, but at the same time, Cambodia had two major operations recently, Operation Golden Dragon and Operation Peace Angel with the Chinese. These are like joint military drills, I suppose. So we do know that Cambodians have collaborated with the Chinese recently. So it'll be very interesting to see how all of this plays out. Again, literally another side of the World War has opened up. And unfortunately, it's in one of the most densely populated places on Earth. So we'll be watching that very closely.
Yeah, as far as the Myanmar situation, this is from Reuters. It says the United States has lifted sanctions designations on several allies of Myanmar's ruling generals that had been imposed during the former Biden administration. The U.S. Treasury Department announced on Thursday, came 2 weeks after the head of Myanmar's ruling junta praised President Donald Trump in a letter and called for an easing of sanctions in a letter responding to a tariff warning. Administration officials said there was no link between the letter and the sanctions decision. A notice from the U.S. Treasury Department said KT Services and Logistics and its founder, a bunch of other groups, have been removed from the U.S. sanctions list. The Treasury Department declined to say why the individuals have been removed from the list. So, as someone who generally supports the junta, I think this is good to see. Mm-hmm. I support it generally, so that's good. However, I hope it doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. will be moving in to influence Myanmar, which obviously I think would make sense if there's sort of a surround Thailand strategy going on here. But, it'd be cool if we could have Brian Berletic on the show to maybe discuss this for an ether hour if this continues to escalate at all, because Thailand is a very interesting country. Vietnam, I think, is the main country that has been sort of cleaved towards the U.S., the Philippines as well, obviously in a bid to surround China and make sure that China's infrastructure, Belt and Road Initiative, as well as its general military economic alliances don't spread to these other major economic population powerhouses like you mentioned, Dimitri. But Thailand and Bangkok, they have high-speed rail with China. They have a lot of influence there. China's their largest export partner. Meanwhile, Cambodia's largest export partner is the United States. So things really go both ways here in Cambodia. Obviously, is generally a poorer and I think less laterally mobile country that can operate autonomously. So it would make sense that they'd be more susceptible to foreign influence, which in theory could also mean China could have more of a foothold there as well. So very interesting developments. The other developments in the East, of course, China, North Korea has obviously been, speaking openly that they would bomb enemies of Russia. They're standing strong by their closest ally. And China is also expanding its military naval exercises, both surrounding Taiwan and Formosa, as well as up near the Korean seas, off the coast of South Korea into their exclusive economic zone and even into Japan's as well. So the Chinese continue to sort of push the boundaries. But there was also the recent huge legislative elections in Japan, which saw big losses for the LDP ruling bloc and their Komeito allies. The LDP went from having 52 seats in the parliament down to 39. And there were huge gains, mostly from actually the far right. The Sansaito Party, which is a Japanese ethno-nationalist immigration restrictionist party, went from having 1 seat up to having 14 seats on the Japanese parliament. There was also I can't remember the name of the party, but there was a hardcore far-right monarchist party that also entered parliament for the first time with 1 seat. I'm forgetting the name of it. Maybe I'll pull it up in 1 second. But generally speaking, immigration restriction has really succeeded in Japan, and there were some pretty major gains there. The actual normal opposition they stayed the same. They didn't lose or gain any seats, but it's clear that even though the current, party claims to sort of be center-right, free market-y kind of stuff, it's clear that what the Japanese people actually want is real nationalism. Obviously, this comes with talk of Japan remilitarizing, which, again, raises fears of the fact that these far-right parties might be co-opted by the United States, that perhaps their militarism and calls for remilitarization could be co-opted towards anti-Chinese sentiment, because it seems the U.S. at this point being so spread thin in their navy and military across the multiple conflicts and fronts they're trying to manage as the world's policeman. It's clear that militarized Japan, if it is aligned with the United States, would be valuable. But if the Chinese were smart, they would recognize that Japanese people are going to be moving in a identitarian direction, and that they would perhaps want to preemptively support Japanese nationalist parties, considering I don't think China has any actual interest of ever invading Japan or somehow Sinifying Japan or anything like that. So I think it would make sense for them to get ahead of that, but they are communists. So we'll see if I've always believed that China are effectively national socialists, socialists with Chinese characteristics, that their version of communism is morphed into their own version of modern, effectively corporatist fascism, which, if that is true, then obviously I think they could support something similar going on in Japan. Maybe not the monarchist elements of some of it, but I think Japan should empower its monarchy once again. That would be quite interesting to watch. But as far as other China news, there was that recent EU-China summit where it appears that no progress was made regarding trade, because it seems the U.S. is obviously pressuring the EU to not move closer to China. But in the midst of all of this is actually while we are recording, this is from Yekia Leiter, the Israeli ambassador to the United States. He said there are troubling signs that China is helping Iran rebuild its ballistic missile program. So again, with those talks of secondary sanctions regarding Russia, as well as, of course, the snapback sanctions on Iran, it appears that China could be really facing a lot of sanctions, both regarding their alliance with Russia as well as Iran, and the United States pressure for the EU to not align itself economically with China.
That's huge news, of course, coming out of East Asia. Of course, as you know, both me and Conrad, in recent years, we have traveled to Japan. We've both seen it. One of the greatest places in the world, I think, in terms of actual technology mixed in with, of course, a traditional culture. So there's nothing really bad we can really say about Japan, its culture. And the fact that they've held on to their monarchy as well. Yes, quite cucked and severely cut away from power via the occupation of the US. But hopefully in the future, maybe when more Orthodox Christian monarchies are restored, there'd be some form of collaboration, just as there was between the governments of Alexander III and under St. Nicholas of Japan. In the past, Japan has one of the oldest Orthodox Christian autonomous churches in Asia, still active. So quite a wonderful country. It's unfortunate that recently the country has fallen under US Western occupation. But in any case, I did want to mention, Conrad, the brief news that many other podcasters are speaking about and dedicating all of their attention to, right? The Trump Epstein files, the fact that Trump is going all in on the fact that he will not be covering the Epstein files, and he's moving away from that. He's calling that a distraction. And in fact, he's hyper-focusing now on the Obama-Russiagate connection, which I think is a huge distraction. Trump's calling the Epstein files a distraction, whilst actually trying to distract the American public with this new, Hillary's a crook, and who's a bigger crook than Hillary? It's not the Clintons, it's Barack Obama and Barack Hussein Obama. He's emphasizing his sort of Middle Eastern Islamic heritage, etc. And it's just bizarre because we know at the end of the day the Epstein files are comically obvious. I mean, there's talks that he's going to pardon Ghislaine Maxwell. If he does that, then I'm not sure if I can say anything positive about Trump moving forward, unless he, of course, brings about an end to the Third World War and brings literally world peace around. Because at this point, he's just collaborating with literal child traffickers, pedophiles, and it's really sad.
Well, and frankly, if you are doing that and bringing about world peace, it's got to be like, okay, are you the Antichrist? You're a pedophile that brings about world peace. Like, what's the what are we doing here? This is some eschatological nonsense. But yeah, you mentioned the Maxwell stuff, which is just insanely egregious, which comes after she supposedly, I think, has now met twice with U.S. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who was Trump's former personal lawyer, which of course is very interesting. I wonder if they were talking about anything besides federal pardons, maybe testifying, these sorts of things. But At this point, White House insiders have said that the possibility of a Ghislaine Maxwell pardon is increasing. That is as of July 26th, which is when this is being recorded. So very, very interesting developments there. Trump is talking more and more about tariffs and a few other things in his Obama situation, but at this point, everyone is sort of distracted by this Ghislaine Maxwell escalation. Before it was just the Epstein stuff, which I think everyone was even getting a little bit tired of talking about. But they're like, all right, now we're going to potentially pardon Ghislaine Maxwell, and this was a Democrat hoax. It's like, dude, what are we doing here? Like, and obviously the reports have come out that supposedly Trump requested Pam Bondi to search the Epstein files for his name was being referenced. It came back that he was, and that was when he decided they're going to go on a full court press to basically act as if this never happened. So again, I'm not willing to go out to say that Trump is, I don't necessarily think there's some kind of smoking gun against Trump, but I think it definitely would cast aspersions on him, connect him to, establishment deep state characters he might not want to be connected with. And so therefore he thought it was worth it to try to play this off. But unfortunately, I think that's definitely going to backfire for him. But some other news, we got to talk about what's going on in Serbia. This is from the National Independent. It says Serbia is ready to make very big compromises in the dispute with Kosovo and remains committed to fully normalizing relations. Serbian Minister of European Integration Nemanja Storovic said in an interview with Austria's APA news agency. Addressing the issue of aligning the EU sanctions against Russia, Stanovic stated that Serbia would impose such measures only when EU membership is within sight. So this comes amidst, again, there have been anti-Vucic protests for a very long time here. I've heard reports from, semi-trusted sources, won't say fully trusted sources, that apparently there is a pro-Vucic coup or pro-Vucic sort of move in the church, the Serbian church coming, where perhaps priests and bishops and officials that have spoken against Vucic will be purged and sidelined. I don't know any truth to that. We're perhaps going to be keeping an eye on it. But unfortunately, Serbia is facing pretty unprecedented pressure to fall in line with, their EU masters that, again, they are openly searching after.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think President Vucic, just his particular stance on Serbia's collaboration with both the EU and Russia, it's not the same as, for example, Turkey choosing between NATO, BRICS, etc. I think it's very much a Vucic and a Serbian elite issue. We know the Serbian people, by and large, besides some of those college and university educated liberals, which is probably less than 2% of the population, the young people who actually are protest in these pro-Western protests in Serbia, most of the Serbian population, including, of course, Djokovic, for example, all the Serbian superstars are all pro-Russian. Right? It's very clear. Vucic is actually fighting against his own nation. And it's quite clear that if he doesn't align with Russia, potentially the future of his presidency and his legacy in and of itself will be that of a traitor. He will be the Boris Yeltsin of Serbia. I think that's where we're going if he doesn't, of course, do the Dodik type pivot, which I think is more towards the right wing, maybe aligning with Hungary. Mind you, Serbian-Hungarian relations, I know many people view them with, they view Serbia as an enemy of Austro-Hungary in that particular imperial construction, but the Hungarians have, for a long time, alongside Serbian knights, fought against the Ottoman Caliphate, in the 1300s, yeah.
Well, and there is that new pipeline that just was announced recently, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. So there's a potential that Serbia does in fact align itself with the EU through Vucic's, I would say artificial, maybe Greek-like. Maybe he is being influenced by Mitsotakis. That's the danger here, Conrad, and by the government in Romania. This real peer pressuring of fellow Orthodox Christian nations. We can't, for example, accuse Vucic of being a traitor to Orthodoxy just because of some sort of economic gains or free trade, when all the other Orthodox countries around him are also EU aligned and against Russia. So that's the problem here. It's that he's not unique and alone in this. He's one of the many unfortunate collaborators. And Russia isn't perfect in and of itself. If Russia was an Orthodox Christian monarchy today, we could officially accuse Vucic of being essentially a traitor to, reinstatement of Orthodox Christian values in Europe. But we can't do that because the Russian Federation really, at the moment, is not entirely healed of those wounds that were dealt to it in the 20th century. So that's also, I think, a major factor. But speaking of the wounds and the current strikes against Orthodox Christianity in Eastern Europe, we'll mention the persecution taking place in the Ukraine. Specifically, it's been reported by Matushka Serafima, who is very pro-Ukrainian, right? We've mentioned her a few times. This is probably the most popular Orthodox Christian nun in all of Ukraine. She's quite well-spoken. She's a best-selling author in Ukraine. It's very interesting how a nun and she's essentially the equivalent of a female archimandrite. So she's a very chiefly mother, probably one of the most influential females in all of Ukraine. She's openly stated that Zelensky's government, and it's the first time probably in her life that she's ever accused the Ukrainian government of anything. She said that Zelensky's government has forced an entire group of nuns and Orthodox Christian priests out of the Ascension Monastery, the Florovsky Monastery in Kiev. This is a monastery dedicated to, I believe, the Ascension feast day. However, it's usually called a monastery after the name of Saint Florus. And Saint Florus and Laurus were two saints who were martyred in the 2nd century in modern-day Kosovo, Illyria. After they were killed, the Roman pagans threw them down an empty well and covered them up with dirt. And basically they were buried alive. So these are very early saints, and there was a church, a monastery dedicated to their honor in Ukraine. Now that church is being, of course, emptied of its nuns by the Ukrainian government. So persecution is well and truly afoot, to the point where you even have pro-Ukrainian monastics like Mother Seraphima openly speaking out and complaining about this. So maybe perhaps her conscience has finally turned, because remember, she was almost, I'm not going to say supporting the schism, but basically blessing Ukrainians to fight against the evil Russian invaders, for the last 3 years. So questionable lady. And in a similar vein, Metropolitan Clement of Nizhinsk, one of the leading Ukrainian bishops, has tried to rationalize and explain to the Ukrainian government in a 4-minute video that he released that he's like, well, look, we're not Russian at all. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is completely disconnected from Russia. And he tried to, again, release this video addressed to the Ukrainian cabinet to try and prevent the Ukrainian government from persecuting the church. But Metropolitan Clement, I don't think he realizes that the Ukrainian cabinet knows exactly what it's doing. Zelensky and his terrorist regime, they persecute the church knowingly. They're openly blaspheming against the Holy Spirit, with knowledge. Like, they have all the data in front of them. They have a direct connection to Metropolitan Onufri. They live in the same city as him, and yet they do not speak to him at all. And they continue persecuting the church. So we have to keep this in mind. There are a lot of bishops in Ukraine who are still hopeful that the persecution will end. And this is contradicted, actually, just this week by, not Metropolitan Clement, by one of our favorite metropolitans, I would say Metropolitan Anthony Pakanich, who very openly in a sermon, and he's the right-hand man of Metropolitan Onufri, you can say he's the secretary of the synod in Ukraine of this canonical church. He openly stated that persecution has begun. Like, before this, Metropolitan Onufri has never really announced that persecution was ongoing, but he stated that over the next month, going into August, the Ukrainian government will be shutting down either the church in its totality or by sections, taking it down monasteries, parishes, cathedrals. This is quite a dire warning, and I think an appropriate one. Metropolitan Anthony, I think, has elected to warn all Ukrainian Orthodox parishioners that your parish may be next, your monastery may be next. Everyone needs to prepare to serve services illicitly and illegally at home. Well, I mean illegally because it goes against the Ukrainian state's directions, right, to disband this UOC construct, which they deem pro-Russian. So it's really heartbreaking to see this finally being announced, but it's true. We rather face reality than be forced into all these deceptive, warm statements. Lukewarmness, of course, is worse than actually admitting what the truth is on the ground, and that is the persecution has been ongoing for 3+ years. This is quite old news. We're just finally announcing it openly. And other news from the bishops of Ukraine, Metropolitan Arseny of Svyatogorsk, which is, of course, located next to Slavyansk and Izyum, that very key area which the Russians are currently trying to push towards after they take Kupiansk, has remained imprisoned even after the court has essentially should be releasing him, because his detention has expired officially on paper. However, he's still imprisoned, which means that it is officially the Zelensky government, the SBU, has passed down either to the judge or whoever's in charge in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, that Metropolitan Arsenius should remain imprisoned and behind bars. Mind you, this one metropolitan is so important because he's the leader of the Svyatogorsk Lavra, which was occupied, according to Ukrainians, occupied by Russia for such a long time. He potentially has connections to people like Igor Strelkov, to all the Russian early Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk separatists. The Ukrainians view him as a symbol of essentially like a spiritual symbol of separatist Donbass in some ways, I think. And the Svyatogorsk Lavra is such a beautiful monastery. In many cases, it can be like, it is highlight of the entire Eastern Ukrainian Orthodox Christian Church, because it is really the beacon of orthodoxy in these lands. And so they need to specifically keep him imprisoned in order to demoralize the monks over there and to make sure that no other bishop dares to speak out. And on a more positive note, we did see Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye visit Cherkasy. So he crossed the Dnieper, visited his good friend Metropolitan Theodosius, and they both co-served this past Sunday, which was quite heartwarming. I think it's good to see two metropolitans who were both, one being a confessor of the faith, the other being a very, really fiery spokesperson for just based Orthodox Christian values in Ukraine. Two of these great, I would say, leaders of the church in Ukraine co-serving, working together. I mean, it's really heartwarming to see them both now, for now, at least free outside of prison, using the freedom to promote orthodoxy in a land which is torn by not just by war, but by active persecution. So it's quite good seeing all of that taking place. And again, these protests that recently took place in Ukraine, Conrad, I think the most heartbreaking aspect of them was that the persecution of the church was not on the agenda. It was about corruption. It was about auditing Zelensky's degenerate government. And clearly, the majority of these young people who are protesting in Ukraine, especially these young girls, college-age university students, they're just not aware of the spiritual stakes of the country and what has led to the current cataclysm, which is tearing the land apart. And I think this is one of the reasons why God is even punishing Ukraine with such disaster now, is simply because, well, it's because of the sins of the people, first and foremost. Ukraine is supposed to be the vanguard against Central European and Western heresies, and it itself has fallen under their influence over time. And in fact, it has corrupted itself with these various sects and schisms. One last piece of news that I think is really important to cover, and this may seem very controversial, but I think it would be amiss not to really bring it up. It's a letter by Igor Strelkov, who we talk about quite a bit. He wrote a letter about from prison, of course, from a Russian prison, about the persecution of the church in Ukraine, specifically about Metropolitan Onufry and what's happening with him. And he criticized Metropolitan Onufry for one reason. He said that, look, in 2014, the Poroshenko government and the Kiev junta took over when the Maidan took place. Metropolitan Onufry was already in charge of the church in Ukraine. He blessed personally, as well as he called other bishops of Ukraine to bless the Ukrainian army's anti-terrorist operation against Donetsk and Lugansk, against the pro-Russian separatist states. He supported the government of Poroshenko to attack Donetsk, to attack Slavyansk, to attack Lugansk. So Metropolitan Onufry was diametrically opposed to people like Givi, Motorola, Mozgovoy, all these other leaders, Igor Strelkov himself. And Strelkov simply mentioned that, look, if only the church in Ukraine had realized back then, 10 years ago, and not the entire church, we mean the higher clergy, of course. If only the higher clergy realized 10 years ago what was happening on their land, perhaps they could have somehow culturally prevented this Zelensky regime from taking over. But it's been 10 years and it's far too late, and now persecution has reached unsustainable levels, and the church in Ukraine hasn't done anything really to stop it from coming to pass. So it's very unfortunate. It's maybe a similar example to the Russian Revolution, where a lot of the highest clergy during the Russian Revolution early on stood down, didn't do anything to prevent the liberal Freemasons or the Bolsheviks from coming to power. And then eventually they were persecuted as well. So it's almost a one-to-one analogy, according to Igor Strelkov. So I think it's quite a sobering message, but one that we need to keep in mind is that when you're inactive, when you support the wrong people in power, you end up, of course, facing the consequences. So that's a really important letter that I think it's good that we addressed it.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody's earned the right to sort of have an opinion on what the bishop should or shouldn't do regarding the frontline situation and, troops in Russia on one side, Ukraine on another side, I think Strelkov has earned the right, even if, we all need to be careful in how we condemn or don't condemn specific members of the hierarchy. But obviously, as you mentioned earlier, Dimitri, even in all of that, Metropolitan Anthony and, Metropolitan Onufry they have still not entered into a real schism with the Moscow Patriarchate, despite all of the pressure, which we do still need to commend them for. But I wanted to mention a brief piece of good news here. Russian Synod has canonized a new saint, a married archpriest, John Domovsky, who was born in 1844. He was born in the village of Prokhovskoye in the Ekaterinnovslav government. He was the son of a deacon. From an early age, he helped his father on the altar, loved the services, was passionate about church singing. Eventually, during the difficult years of the Civil War. He lived well into almost 100 years old, well into the 1930s. He was an ardent follower of Patriarch Tikhon. He firmly denounced the Renovationists, saved many clergy and lay people from the temptation of joining their schism. Obviously, he continued his ministry throughout the difficult persecutions of the 1920s, and he reposed in 1930, was buried at Sofia Cemetery in Rostov-on-Don, and his veneration began immediately after his repose, and over the years spread more and more among the believers. Already in the 1950s, collections of testimonies about the holiness of his life and miracles performed through his prayers began and have continued to the present time. He was married. He had 4 daughters. He was a priest at St. Nicholas Church in Vasilyevka, Slavya-Noserbsky district in Russia. He was a zealous missionary, a composer of church music. So it's beautiful that we have not only a new confessor of the church who suffered under persecution under the Bolsheviks, but lived a long life, but also a married family priest. So very fascinating, a new intercessor that we have. So St. John of Rostov, as I guess he's being called, pray for us.
Yeah, no, very heartwarming, especially when he was actively going against the Renovationist schism. I think it's a big message, sort of canonizing someone who was just an archpriest. All these bishops were going into schism, including Bishop and future Patriarch Sergei Stargorodsky. Super learned people were falling to the temptation of separating from orthodoxy, and yet you had a simple archpriest, one of tens of thousands in Rostov, not the most closest city to St. Petersburg or Petrograd or Moscow, facing sort of all this pressure, and yet he doesn't yield to it. I mean, this is a great saint, great example. And the more saints we have like this, who set higher standards for not just our higher clergy, the bishops, but also the regular priests, the better. Because it's one thing having great saints like St. John of Kronstadt, who are so high up, they've healed hundreds of people, they've exorcised demons, they've even resurrected people, and yet having other saints who perform less miracles than that, who are clairvoyant, like St. John of Rostov was, and who, again, lived during more tumultuous times than somebody like St. John of Kronstadt. It's another great saint who I think we can pray for intercession to. So generally, a very good news story, Conrad. Very nice that we covered it. And thank you to Ortho Christian for actually writing these great articles covering these new canonizations very succinctly and beautifully.
No, Ortho Christian is always a great resource, and we always like reporting about the new saints here at the end of the episode to always end on a bit of a high note. But again, with all of that, be sure to keep all of those affected by the conflicts we discussed on the show in your prayers: the genocide in Gaza, the war in Russia and Ukraine, the ongoing war in Cambodia and Thailand, those suffering under the, Mossad oppression in Iran, those in Syria, of course, suffering under the Jolani regime and, Israeli occupation. There's so many people now suffering under, the yoke of, world Jewry and their sort of self-imposed third world war. So again, keep the world in your prayers, keep the church in your prayers. Again, keep the persecuted church in Ukraine, keep the persecuted Christians in the Levant, keep the persecuted hierarchs in Cyprus and elsewhere in your prayers, because these are prayer, again, is, as the scriptures say, the prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And so my prayers may not be doing too much, but I think we might have some good people in the audience that are listening whose prayers are definitely needed. So thank you all so much for listening here to the end of the episode. If you want to subscribe here and support the show, get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co. Just $7 a month, or I think $65 a year if you want to get it for a whole year. Great deal. You get hundreds of hours of content, including our new Ether Hour discussion with Dr. David Patrick Harry about the Khazarian Empire, the history of the Khazar people, whether or not they are the Ashkenazi Jews that we know today, answering a lot of controversial questions. So be sure to check that out. It's going to be linked down in the description below. I encourage everyone to watch the Brian Berletic video about Thailand, Cambodia. We're going to link that below as well. So check that out. But again, like this video on Substack. We really want to be getting the likes up here on Substack, getting to 40, 50, 60 plus likes on all of the episodes. So if you're hearing me now, like the episode, like it on YouTube as well. We want to get as many likes as we can on the YouTube videos. So be sure to subscribe to us on Telegram as well at World War Now Telly. Follow us on Twitter at World War Now _. Follow me at GnomeRad. I'm well over 10,000 followers now. So thank you so much. Be sure to follow me. Keep growing there. Follow Dimitri at WWN Host. Again, subscribe to the channel on YouTube. I should be back live streaming very soon on Tuesday evenings. In theory, we should also be live streaming on Substack. So Substack, X, and YouTube. We should be streaming everywhere. So very exciting developments. Obviously, again, worldwarnow.co. Subscribe for free to get all the episodes in your inbox. Get behind the paywall, support the show, get access to all of the Ether Hour episodes. It really is what keeps us going, what keeps the lights on here at the proverbial World War Now bunker. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.